Family apartment complex approved for a condominium conversion. Wow. The recommended CEQA action is Class 1 categorical exempt, CEQA guidelines, Section 15301 and Section 15061B3. Staff's recommended action is to determine that the minimum requirements of Pacifica Municipal Code Section 9-4.2455E for rent increase have been met. I think I'll ask staff then to go ahead with any report that they might have on this continued item.
Chair, members of the Commission. On June 19th, the Planning Commission held a public hearing to discuss the proposed rent increase request. The staff report for that and all of the attachments were included in your packet, as well as the minutes from that meeting. The Planning Commission raised several issues at that hearing, and I'll kind of go over very briefly the responses to some of those questions. One of the commissioners asked about, we talked a lot about the increases in rents over time, and one of the planning commissioners asked if the increase in home values corresponded to the increase in rents over time. It proved to be a challenge to find data that was consistent and that didn't have pitfalls, so there were pros and cons to many different data sources, so I gave them all to you. Zillow and Trulia showed increases in home prices from 2008 to 2017 at about 30%. Those two data sources were consistent. The census data showed home prices going down until 2013 and then just going up very slowly since 2015 and not fully recovered to their original prices. So that just didn't quite seem intuitively to match what one would expect. So we also looked at the San Mateo County indicator report on the cost of living. And that report looks at county-wide, not just City of Pacifica values. And the data in that report said from 2010 to 2015, the average market rent increased 49%, and the average median home price sales increased 52%. So there's the data. The Planning Commission also asked about the condition of other apartment complexes that we had used in the rent survey. So we received all those those condition reports from the county, and there's a table in there, and it's a mixed bag. About half had no violations, about half had some violations, most of them minor, and they seem all to have been resolved.
Okay.
There was a question on the legal status of the project as a condominium, and it's pretty much been confirmed that once the map is recorded, that it technically is a condominium complex, and that most of the conditions of approval and all of those items that we were saying hadn't been done yet are required at the time prior to the first sale of a unit. There were several items that we needed to follow up with the owner on, and he is prepared tonight to address information regarding the status of the project and a future marketing program, annual inspections and how they deal with tenant work requests, their pest control program, and other evidence of the condition of the project. The Planning Commission also asked about their ability to phase in rent increases. And it was determined that the municipal code gives Planning Commission the discretion to approve any rent increase. Therefore, we believe that the Planning Commission can approve any level of rent increase and can determine that level and phase it if they so desire. The other item was choosing a subcommittee to go visit the site and look at the conditions firsthand, and Mr. Clifford will be presenting tonight what they found out at their subcommittee visit.
Okay. Well, thank you, Ms. Iganos. Did anybody have any questions prior to Commissioner Clifford and Commissioner Behringer sharing their input? Does anybody have any question for staff with respect to this report?
Yes.
Commissioner Clifford. Thank you.
During the last meeting, the Legal Aid Society sent us a letter, and one of the questions that came up was, is this, if we grant this rent increase, is the rent increase is done with and they can raise the rent in forever? Or do they have to come back to us for any additional rent increases they want to get?
So I think this question touches on some conversation that we had at the last meeting. So the commission has the discretion to phase a rent increase, so that by its definition would be a certain amount now and a certain amount phased in the future, if that is what the commission so desires. The commission may, as an option, approve a one-time rent increase, and future rent increases would need to come back to the commission. And the reason for that is the three factors that the commission must consider are kind of point-in-time factors. And so it's very difficult for staff to make a recommendation of approval that is prospective given the parameters that the municipal code that we're working under, contained in the municipal code.
Great, thank you. Commissioner Clifford, anything else?
I guess I want to follow up on that. In terms of the
Prospective.
It sounded like staff would be uncomfortable with it being all-encompassing.
Correct.
So, and was the staff report, does the staff report reflect that if we give the 25% or less or something different at this point in time, is that it, or do we go ahead and have them come back later? I want to be very
That's how
clear
I
on
intended
whether,
it.
if we give a rent increase at this point in time, do they ever in the future have to come back for an additional rent increase?
So it was certainly our intention to write it such that a future rent increase would need to come back. And I think before this item is concluded, if our legal counsel feels like we need to word something a little differently to make sure that's explicit, we can do that.
Thank you. Commissioner Gordon.
Thanks. I've got a couple of questions for staff. The first is just to clarify your position on our ability, our authority to approve. Let's say, for example, it was the wishes of the commission to approve a 25% increase, but do it in phases, in several phases. I thought I heard you say that we have that authority, but on the other hand, you're uncomfortable with it? Is that what I heard?
No, you have that authority. I am saying I would not feel comfortable with an approval stating, for example, and 5 years from now, you can also get a 10% increase.
It sounds like you would be more in favor of, if we did a phase in, if we did it in phases, that it would be in a shorter time period,
Correct.
like I'm going to test your comfort zone, like 3 years, 2 years?
I would say 3 years is,
Okay,
it's arbitrary, but it's what I had in mind.
I understand. It's arbitrary, but in a reasonable way. Second question, that was helpful. In terms of the 3 points, the 3 factors that we're supposed to consider in evaluating the rent increase, I see that with respect to the first factor, prevailing rents for similar units, we've got lots of data, and that's really helpful. The third prong, the condition of the unit, it sounds like we're going to get a report from the subcommittee. Is that right?
Yes.
And then in terms of the second bullet point, I think I was a little bit handicapped because I didn't have a hard copy, but can you just point to me where that data is, the residential rent component of the Bay Area Cost of Living Index, or the DOL? Or you can just summarize for me what it showed, that's fine too.
It's in the original.
Oh, it's long, so you could summarize it in like one sentence? That would be great. That would be perfect.
It's a very confusing thing. because the terminology in the municipal code doesn't match the current terminology in the Bay Area cost of living. So there were two components of the, the code says residential rent component. When you look at actual components, there was, and I'm trying to, overall shelter index, and then rent of primary residence index. So which one do you pick? So rent of primary residence seemed more equivocal. So that one increased by 6.4% in 1 year from December of 15 to 16, which was the most recent data available at the time I did the staff report. So, but they don't have that historically.
Okay. That doesn't sound very helpful.
It's not.
So are we saying, so just to interrupt for a sec, it sounds like the first and the third prong are going to really be more informative for us as opposed to the second prong? Because of the lack of
Likely,
historical data, because we wouldn't want to extrapolate 1 year to the other years. That's not,
Correct.
that's
So,
not good.
so what I did was extrapolate, I mean, even if it was 5%, if it was 5% and you extrapolated it from 2008 until now, it would be a 48% increase. If it was 3%, it would be a 27% increase. So even just looking at those round
Right.
numbers, that kind of
Okay.
gives you a ballpark.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Behringer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I have one quick question. This kind of flows with Commissioner Clifford's concern about stepping the rental, and I'm not sure that we had a definitive response from our attorneys last time we discussed this. Is it possible to condition the increases with, by tying them to tangible improvements made at the property, with the understanding that the improvements would come either simultaneously or relatively close to the rental increases? I think we'd asked that before, and I don't know that we got an answer, because I know that's important to Commissioner Clifford and myself.
Yeah, it's a good question, and we did discuss a little bit the last meeting, and I did have the opportunity to go back and confirm that my position has remained unchanged, that the commission's authority with respect to the condo conversion ordinance relates simply to a rent increase, and your discretion is to assess whether the rent increase is appropriate based on the three conditions that Commissioner Gordon just touched upon, and the conditioning the rent increase on tangible conditions of improvement goes beyond what the ordinance allows
Okay.
the commission to consider.
So, but hypothetically speaking, if we took a more pragmatic approach to it, we could say no to the rent increase, repairs could be made, and they could resubmit, and we could reconsider at that time, in theory.
Certainly, because you can make your determination tonight based on the conditions of the unit. That is permissible.
At the time the application is made,
At the time
seeking
the
the rent increase.
Yes, and at the time of this hearing.
Gotcha.
Which, based on the fact that the subcommittee has has made observations on the conditions of the units, those observations can be considered, obviously, in terms of the conditions that exist today.
Okay, thank you.
Excellent. Well, it looks like we don't have any more questions for staff at this point. So what I think I'd like to do at this point is turn the matter over to Commissioner Clifford, and I think Commissioner Behringer perhaps will have some comment as well, so that we can hear from what the subcommittee observed.
Get the mic over here. Now, this is the first time I've ever done this with this thing, and also first time I've ever done a subcommittee report to the commission, so bear with me. Subcommittee report, Miramont's Summit rent increase application, Planning Commission, July 17, 2017. Tina, I think I'm going to need you, because it's not moving.
I'm stuck.
We're off to a good start.
Yeah, right.
I don't know if I'm just not doing it. I can hear it click. Oh. Okay, the planning commission shall consider three factors: prevailing rents for similar units, the residential rent component of the Bay Area Cost of Living Index of the United States Department of Labor, and the condition of the units. The Commission appointed a subcommittee with the relevant background and experience to report on the conditions of the units. Now, just to give a background on what our qualifications are, I've been a general contractor for 30 years. I've been in the construction industry for 45, and Commissioner Behringer has been a developer. He's also worked with Habitat for Humanity and is currently working in the development of cell phone sites. So he also has a very extensive background in construction. In comparison, the basic structures look to be slightly run down. The landscaping was not anywhere near what the landscaping for the other units around their other apartment units. The identifying sign for the office for the Miramont Summit was in terrible shape. Trash bins were overflowing on both of our visits, although the second visit is when I got the picture, and it doesn't show as anywhere near as bad as it was on the first visit. Let's try this. Moving forward, there's the summit sign. You can see the exposed rust, missing corners, and so on and so forth. And in the bottom picture is a trash can that's overflowing. And they have pickup 3 days a week. And possibly if they had a fourth, a daily pickup, they would not have these kinds of conditions. I'll leave this for the Commissioner Behringer to comment on. These are things that he integrated.
Oh, well, we took a look at the entire property, and included in that would be the parking areas, which were basically not striped to indicate what parking would go where, and there were large areas where the asphalt was simply breaking up and needs to be removed and repaved. And then the electric car plug-in stations that were discussed at the last hearing were non-existent. They had not been installed.
And in terms of the guest parking, there actually isn't any, at least is what I remember from the manager of the apartment complex. And the street curbs in that area are all painted red, so that really leaves the apartment dwellers without an ability to have guests. The windows are in need of resealing or replacement. We could see leaks around the windows. We could see damaged trim, and on the inside of the apartments that we actually visited, there was water damage, and in one apartment, a substantial amount of mold. These cement patio walls, some of them are actually sinking on one section of their foundation and tilting away from the building. The area under the building did not appear to have any seismic retrofits, and that creates a situation of the underside of the buildings is the parking areas, and those parking areas then create a soft storage situation. So I would recommend that at some time in the future the owner look into retrofitting into that. Also noticed that area would seem to need some level of fireproof, because the back wall of these parking spaces was plywood and only, it didn't have any kind of real burn ratio, so if there's a fire in one of the parking stalls, it's going to get right up under the buildings. The main electrical panels are heavily rusted, and under one of the buildings, I noted an 1.5 inch galvanized conduit that had become unmoored and was draping across the bottom of that building. The laundry area, it had been freshly painted. The washers and dryers were in bad shape with heavy rust on. It says some there, but it was actually most of the wash machines and some of the dryers. 3 of the 6 washers were broken and not serviceable. One of the 6 dryers was out of service, and the window showed signs of leakage. The 2 apartment visits, mold damage in multiple rooms, signs of water intrusion and dry rot around the windows, and in one room, signs of water reaching the electrical baseboard heating unit. Leaky or running faucets. One unit we went into, the tub was running steadily. The second one we went into was, there was a steady drip. Tub stopper not functioning in one of the units, so you couldn't actually use the tub. And evidence of dry rot in the floor at the base of the tub. There was also evidence of dry rot at the base of a window on the other apartment. And it's a little hard to see here, but the upper picture shows the picture on the right, the larger picture, shows the mold and water intrusion. There's an electrical outlet, and then there's an electrical baseboard heating. You could, in a betterly defined picture, you can actually see the watermarks on the wall where it's running down, and a watermark on top of the water of the heating unit. And the picture on the left shows the sheetrock trim around the window disintegrating. Let's see, the corrosion on the metal shower frame. In both apartments, they were heavily corroded, and in one it was ready to fail. The kitchen stove was missing the shield that protects, and that should be oven burners from food and human contact. So the burners at the bottom of the oven were just completely exposed. And in that unit, there was also a rat trap in the kitchen, which reaffirms the complaint that some of the tenants had about rodent problems. One apartment did not appear to have had any basic maintenance, and that's including floor coverings, and that would be for a long period of time. There's the shower doors. I don't know that you can actually fully see it because they are a little fuzzy, but it's very, very corroded there. The kitchen cabinets in one unit were sagging and the doors misaligned, and I do mean sagging. They were very, very bowed in the center. The countertop at that kitchen sink had rotted through, and the refrigerator door is sagging and the gasket coming off. This causes the refrigerator to run nearly all the time. That's cabinets there. You can see the misaligned doors. You can't actually see the bowing, but that is an indication of the problem. And then the refrigerator, you can see that the man can put his hand behind the refrigerator gasket. And the door actually sags down so that there's a gap at the top of the refrigerator door so that the cold air from the refrigerator actually escapes. And the sink over here in the lower left-hand corner, right-hand corner, excuse me, lower right-hand corner, that brown spot at the edge of the sink is actually a place where the countertop is rotted through. And that's that.
Thank you very much.
That's a question.
I'm sorry, it sounds like Commissioner Gordon wanted to ask a question. Go ahead.
Sure. Thank you for that really helpful presentation, guys. One question for you. You saw 2 units, is that right?
Yes.
And how did you determine which units to see?
We were invited to see those units. Obviously, we couldn't just go pound on doors and say we're here to inspect.
Right.
We didn't have that kind of authority or desire.
I'm in no way trying to rally around the cause here, but I'm just curious if there's any indication that, are these representative of, do we have any way of knowing whether these are representative of the other units, or are, 2 units out of 100 and something, I just got no idea whether those are, like I said, representative of the other units or not. Only reason I'm concerned is I'm just playing devil's advocate here. If you went to see the units into which you were invited by people who were especially upset about the condition of their apartment, then we may not be seeing a representative sample. That's my only concern.
Yes, and I have the same concern, but I will state that we had other people who sent letters and also came and spoke at the last meeting, who reported conditions similar to these 2 units. So although I don't have any idea what percentage of the units have these problems, I know that from observation that at least these 2 do, and there were several others that reported similar conditions.
Thanks.
Commissioner Behringer.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that. I fully understand that this isn't statistically relevant, but I think that one of the things that kind of was significant to me was the fact that both of these places we visited were long-term tenants. One was 11 years, and I think the other was 13 years. And to me, as a person who's managed apartment buildings in my career, the fact that they were allowed to exist like that for a long-term tenant indicates a fairly substantial management problem and shortcoming. If you've got a bad tenant, why are they there 11 years? Why are they there 13 years? So, and we were talking about carpeting that hadn't been replaced in 11 years. So, whether that's indicative or they're, it's kind of hard, like, why are they the only ones out of 170? It just, when you look at it logically, it just doesn't seem to make sense. The other thing is, when we looked at the exterior, there's a pattern of bad maintenance. There's a pattern of poor maintenance here. We just happen to be able to have access to 2 of the units. There may be others that were in better condition. I certainly would recognize that, but I'm seeing a pattern that causes me concern.
Did you have a sense that the occupants had made their concerns known to the owners?
They expressed to us, both of them, that they had on numerous occasions expressed that. Now, whether they did or not, we certainly can't corroborate that. I'm sure the owner will want to comment on that when he has his opportunity to make his presentation. Other than giving us the ability to inspect every single apartment that's in that complex, which, logistically is not how I want to spend the next month of my life. But, I think there is definitely a pattern that would indicate that there are certain corrective steps that need to be taken if they're going to be talking about a market rate project that would have market rate tenants. I think the maintenance is certainly not up to that level. Can it be at that level? Of course. Other properties in the immediate area are clearly up at that level, so it's possible.
Thank you. Well, I don't see any further comment or question at this point, so I want to thank Commissioners Clifford and Behringer for taking the time to gather that information and that data point for us, recognizing that there's still, other data points that are relevant as well. I think at this point, I want to go ahead and open the public hearing. The way we would do this in the ordinary course is allow the applicant first to speak to, where we are in the process here, and to, frankly, respond as well to the staff report, the subcommittee report, and any other matters that he wishes to.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm Mark Hazloop, and I'm the applicant on behalf of the owners. First of all, I need to apologize for not being at the last meeting. The morning of the last meeting, I went to the doctor, and they took me to the emergency room, and I had emergency surgery the next morning. I was then in Stanford Hospital for 6 days, so please accept my excuse slip.
Well, of course, we're glad you're here.
I think if I had been here, I could have answered a lot of the questions that went unanswered. First of all, I'd like to go into a bit of the status of the project, although, as the chair pointed out, it's not really germane to the application, but it seemed to be a lot of prurient interest in where we are. The map was recorded in 2014, creating a condominium under the Government Code, the Civil Code, and the Pacifica municipal ordinances. The rest of the requirements are for sale and to be accomplished at the time of sale. They will be certified by certificates of occupancy on each and every unit before they can be sold. Also, there are subdivision reports that create conditions. Those are put out by the state through the Bureau of Real Estate. The Homeowners Association was incorporated. The CCNRs were recorded in April of 2015. The applicant has applied to the Department of, I'm showing my age, they used to be the Department of Real Estate, it's now the Bureau of Real Estate, for a phased subdivision, which means that the project will be sold in 6 phases, and there is a subdivision report known as a white paper that has been issued and approved by the state on each and every one of the phases. The Homeowners Association budgets have been approved. The only thing required to complete and sell these units is the development of a marketing plan. And while some of you may have experience in construction or building management, I don't know if you have experience in marketing of condominiums. And this is true of conversions or new condominiums. At the time that the owners are ready to sell, there will be pricing established. The owners will then establish model homes, and in a project like this, there would be a 2-bedroom, 2-bath, a 2-bedroom, 1-bath, and a 1-bedroom, 1-bath model home. These would be vacant units that would come up after people had moved, and they would be completely refurbished to meet the current not only conditions of approval, but to bring them to the status that would be necessary to get the best market rate on a sale. This includes new wall surfaces. This includes new floor coverings. This includes countertops, vanities, appliances, bath fixtures, and hardware. There will be 3 levels. There will be building standard. One of the models will be fitted out with building standard quality furnishings. One unit will be the next level up, and the 3rd unit will be the top-of-the-line furnishings. More expensive appliances, more expensive floor coverings, more expensive finishes. There will also be in the model homes a presentation by a contract furnisher where the prospective owners will be able to look at, decide on the types of window coverings and other furnishings they're going to like, and they will be able to contract for that. The common areas also will be subject to a condition of approval, and that's when all the current conditions will be met. The thing to keep in mind, this is a risk that these current owners, by delaying, are assuming, is that the code that is applied at the time of the certificate of occupancy is the current code at that time. It's not the code in 2008 when this was approved. It's not the code today. It will be the code then, including separate metering of utilities. And after January 1 of 2018, this also includes separate metering or sub-metering of water. So, in essence, the condition of sale is really the date that these will be brought up to the current market standards for sale condominiums. Now, let's talk about the rental increase and some of the issues that were mentioned at the last meeting. What is in the record is the comparison of the standards at this project with other projects in the area. The staff and their consultant, Ms. Noss, has provided that information through the county. Pacifica does not have its own housing authority. Some cities do, but you don't. And therefore, you rely on the county. And the county reports are part of public record. And I believe that the reports from the county of San Mateo about our project are essentially the same, no different, over the last several years than any of the other projects that they've looked at. The subcommittee inspection, and it's already been noted, is not really a scientific sampling. The subcommittee did not request from us access to any other units. We believe that the units inspected are, hate to say this, but they are relatively problem tenants. Unit 6, which I believe is one of the units that was inspected, is overcrowded with goods, materials, and services. There are I'll show you the work orders in a moment. There's a stack of work orders on that unit. One involves the replacement of the valve in the shower. It's a 3-day operation because you're going to have to open up the shower enclosure, replace the valve, tape, texture, remud the wall, retile it, and it's a 3-day process. We've never been told that we can have the bathroom for 3 days. That unit also complained, I believe, at one time about conditions of various deterioration in, just recently we took the bullet on ourselves and moved some of the tenants' possessions and replaced the subflooring underneath the kitchen cabinets. We're prepared to repaint, we're prepared to install or take care of the window enclosures, but we need to be able to get access. We also are concerned about that unit because of the amount of material. We don't believe that it meets fire code for access for 36 inches at the front door or some of the other aspects. One of the other units that was viewed is a unit that we've had trouble with on occupancy. It is occupied, we believe, most of the year by 4 people. It is, I believe it's a 1-bedroom, 900-square-foot unit, and it does not meet occupancy requirements for 4 people. Also, the dampness load in a unit with 4 people. You all know, everybody here knows, that Pacifica, being a beach community, has a higher humidity factor than anybody else. So these are not excuses. These are just facts. These are factors that combine with things. The other unit in question, we were told a couple of months ago that they were moving. We offered them a 2-bedroom unit to take care of the occupancy situation. We were told that they couldn't afford a 2-bedroom unit, and then we were told they were going to move. And we said, fine, when you move, then we'll go in and do our normal refurbishment at turnover. The gentleman came back from vacation and indicated that they decided that they were not going to move. So now we're kind of back to square one with them. I have with me tonight, and I'll give it to staff, and they can make copies. Just a short letter that the property manager went around today. They got 9 signatures from people that are more than happy with the cooperation, et cetera, that we're dealing with. Let's talk a little bit, and I may go over my time a little bit, about the maintenance programs at Marymount. We do not have a set program for replacing every appliance every X number of years, replacing carpets every X number of years. They're done on an as-needed basis. We have technicians. If someone complains about an appliance, they go in, they inspect. If the appliance needs to be replaced, it's replaced. If the appliance can be repaired, it's repaired. We also have, and I will try and move this very quickly, we do an annual inspection where the property manager goes through each and every unit on an annual basis. And the property manager at that time prepares work orders for the things that they see. Now, this is a visual inspection. We do not go into people's closets. We do not move their clothes. We do not take their dishes out of the cabinets. We do not take stuff out from underneath the kitchen sink. It's a visual inspection. And these are the work orders that came out of the last inspection, which I believe was in April? In April. And there are a couple in there for Unit 6. These are the work orders over the last year. The way it works, it's a three-part form. The tenant makes a request, either in person or by email, and it's a three-part form. One goes to the office, one goes to the repair staff, and one goes to the tenant. So the tenant has proof of every time they've made a request for work.
Thank you. I'll ask you to go ahead and wrap up.
Okay,
if you could, please.
I'll try and wrap up. We talked about that. If you want, I can talk about how the tenant's right of first refusal for sale will work. The timing of the increase is very important to us. This application was filed June 1 of 2016. Despite many, many requests to staff, I have never, ever had any explanation why it's taken us over a year to get a hearing on this. You can get an EIR heard in less than a year. You want to spread this out over time? You've already spread it out over 2 years. The city's done that. If we had gotten a hearing in 3 or 4 months, we would have had a rent increase in 2016 and a rent increase in 2017. Lastly, I'd like to point out that we're asking for a 25% increase or market, whichever is less. We are not going to be coming back ad infinitum into the future under our program, because easily, even under everybody's numbers, within 2 years we'll be at market. And we're at market, we're not entitled to any more increase, nor would we be asking for any more.
Thank you, Mr. Hayslip. I'm going to allow just a couple more seconds if you have anything else to add.
I just would sort of in general take my applicant hat off. Landlords can't solve income inequality. If tomorrow I took my Harry Potter wand and poof, there were 3,000 new housing units in Pacifica, we would not have a rental crisis. We would not have a Pacifica that anyone would recognize, but we would not have a rental crisis. Thank you.
Thank you. We may have some question or comment for you after we've closed the public hearing. If that's all right, I want to just go ahead and get through public hearing, then we'll go ahead and perhaps we'll perhaps come back to Mr. Hayslip after that. I have one speaker card. If there's anybody else who wants to speak to this matter, I'd ask you go ahead and fill out a speaker card. In the meantime, I have a speaker card for Wanda Whitaker. Ms. Whitaker, if you wanted to approach the podium. And you'll have 3 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioners. I have been a resident at Marymount Gateway since 2003, so I am a longtime resident. I know a lot about the property because I have history. I can tell you that there has been a problem, particularly with the trash bin, but I tell you one thing, it's gotten a lot better than it used to be. When I first got there, it was horrible, but I think I've been through 3 managers at the property. The last manager that has been hired has been much better than the other managers. And every time I have requested something, it has been taken care of. Now, the forms that he is relating to, we just got those forms from the last manager before this one. And I think that was like a year and a half ago, where you actually can fill out the form for improvements. But I must admit, and I must be truthful, that I've really never had a problem with asking them to do something for me. It's always been taken care of almost immediately. So I don't have a problem with that. I do have a problem with the rent increase simply because I haven't had a rent increase since 2008. I think I've had 2 rent increases, one in 2005 and another one in 2008, and then it was just month to month. But I think there were some other things that were happening legally with the property that forbade them for increasing the rent. As far as increasing the rent, I do know, particularly talking with one manager in regards to the trash bin, because there are lots of raccoons. There's a huge raccoon problem and rodent problem. I talked with him about that, and we talked about the trash needs to be dumped more than once, 3 times. We have people coming from all over dumping trash in that bin, and it's not fair to the people who live there. But I do want to say, as far as the rent increase, you know, to improve the property, I know you need a rental increase. I just don't like the 25% because it's very quick, and I'm speaking for people who cannot be here today, who may be disabled, who may, you know, be on Social Security or something like that. I do think that it should be a gradual process or 5%. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Whitaker. I again note that I don't have any other speaker cards, so I'm absent that. I think I'll close the public hearing, but I did want to note that we have a document that's been presented to staff, and we'll make it a part of the administrative record. This is, it looks like a letter or a petition or something in that form to the Planning Commission regarding the Marymount Summit condos, and it's dated, looks like July, I can't tell if it's 13th or 17th, but it's it speaks to the experience of the signatories working with the management of the apartment complex. And the points materially are that management is cooperative and responsive to our inquiries and questions. Any repair items are addressed promptly and satisfactorily. On move-in, the units had been cleaned and refurbished and in good condition, and that management has inspected the signatories' units annually since those signatories having lived there. And I'll go ahead and pass it on. Most of the signatures, candidly, are illegible, at least to me, but I'll pass it on to folk on the commission so they can see it. That'll be a part of the administrative record. Let's see, it's a little hard to tell. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Something like 9 is my count. So go ahead and close the public hearing and bring the matter then back to the commission. Commissioner Gordon.
Sure, thanks, Chair. I had a question for staff, and then I was going to have a question for the applicant. So something that the applicant had stated was that they submitted an application for the rent increase back in January 2016, and he was complaining that there was an undue delay. I wanted your feedback, your response to that.
Yes, it has been in our office for a long period of time. We, as you know, have been very busy with quite a few large legislative policy projects that we're working on, and this was not deemed to be subject to the Permit Streamlining Act. It's not a development project, and so it was one that we were able, although I appreciate the applicant does not appreciate this, but we were able to take a little bit more time with and carefully consider.
Mm-hmm. And in the normal, okay. Thanks. All right, so, and I had a question for the applicant. Do I need to reopen?
Well, if Mr. Hayslip, go ahead and ask your question. I don't think we need to reopen the public hearing.
Okay.
Just simply ask your question.
Okay, I'm glad to see that you're back on your feet.
Thank you. Me too.
And like you yourself, I was not at the last hearing, so I'm asking this for the first time. From the record, it's clear that there's a very large gap between market rate and the range of rents that appear to be being charged. Assuming, and let's set aside the issue of the condition of the units right now, because it sounds like we have, from the subcommittee that the units that we saw were pretty dilapidated, but I understand your position that that's not representative. But let's assume that that it's apples to apples. There's a large gap, between market rate and what you guys are charging, right?
Correct.
Well in excess of 25%. And my question is pretty simple. Why didn't you guys do something about this earlier? I mean, the gap every year is just growing and growing and growing in terms of the disparity between market rate and what you're charging. I assume it's not because you guys are...
We're not asleep at the switch.
No, you're not like philanthropists, right?
As you know from the packet, there was a lawsuit filed a couple of years ago, which took a couple of years to wind its way through the court. And my editorial comment on it is that that lawsuit was a direct result of the horribly written condo conversion ordinance that Pacifica has. The condo conversion ordinance doesn't even mention...
It sounded like the basis of the complaint was that you didn't follow the rules. So I don't know, I take offense at like you're saying that, well, it wasn't our fault that we didn't follow the rules, it was the rules' fault for being the rules.
If you read the decision...
I did.
Yeah. What the judge said essentially is that this is what the rules are and this is what I see the law says. And on the one side, your interpretation for the plaintiffs, I agree with some of what you say and I find in your favor, and I disagree with some of what you say and I find in the defendant's favor.
That's fine, but what does that have to do with what my question was?
We didn't want another lawsuit while that was still pending concerning rent increases.
That doesn't, okay, that's not very persuasive. Why would you coming to us to request a rent increase, therefore ipso facto mean a lawsuit? That's not persuasive.
Well, if you look at the lawsuit, and I did not represent the developers in that lawsuit, they had other counsel, but one of the issues was the purpose of the relocation provisions of your ordinance and the purpose of this particular provision that we're here on today, the rent increase, is to prevent someone that does a condo conversion from jacking up the rents so that it forces everybody out so that they have a nice, clean project to deal with, okay? And what it says is if, because of the conversion, people make the decision to leave, you have to give them certain benefits, okay? In the face of being told that we had to pay relocation benefits to people that moved of their own free accord, okay? Not because of anything that we did or the condo conversion, but of their own free accord. Being told that, we did not want to turn around and come to you with a rent increase because it would look like we were jacking up the rents to try and clear the place out.
But if you're only asking for rents that go up to market rate, how would that be perceived as jacking up? The only reason I'm pursuing this point is because I found it distasteful, your point about, well, the city's delayed 2 years, we would have gotten a rent increase. Well, it's not 2 years, it's 1.5 years from the time of submission. And as far as I know, it's 8 years between the time of condo conversion and your initial application. So in terms of delay, an 8-year delay is pretty substantial. And the result is that it puts the tenants in some very tough position, and us as well. We're approving a 25% rent increase like that is it would have been far better to have something much more gradual. And I was just trying to find out why you didn't take that more sort of reasonable, in my opinion, reasonable approach over time, rather than wait 8 years and then come back for, one big one.
Now, whether it's a compelling argument or not, I can tell you that the primary reason is that the owners were as nervous as a cat in a room full of rocking chairs about any rental increase until the lawsuit was over, okay? That's just a fact. Now, whether that's compelling to you or not, that's up to you to make a decision. The one thing I do want to state and get on the record...
Do the rent increase till the white slip.
Sit down. The one thing I do want to point out is that, and the chair pointed this out, is what does this process look like going forward, okay? We've asked for 25%. Within 2 years, we'll be at market. We won't be back anymore, okay? If you guys tell us that you're going to give us a one-time rent bump now and you have to come back again, is it going to take another 14 or 15 months to get a hearing? Okay? You know, we seem to be weighing fairness here.
That's fine, but you're kind of getting ahead of yourself. You know, my only question was why the delay, and it sounds like your answer is because you were afraid of being sued.
Okay.
Thank you.
One other thing is that, and I look at the criteria for granting the rent increase, and there are 3 of them, and some sense of inherent fairness is not one of the criteria.
Thank you. Did you have any more questions at this point? No. Thank you. Commissioner Campbell.
Actually, my question got answered. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Commissioner Clifford.
I had a question for the representative of
Well,
the, he could come back.
Mr. Hayslip, I think you're back on.
Too many people talking to me at once, sorry.
Appreciate that, yep.
Commissioner Clifford? Yes.
It is Commissioner Clifford. And I also am glad to see that you're back up on.
Thank you.
I'm really happy for that. Hopefully, everything is continued. You talked about the lawsuit. When did the lawsuit actually, what point in time did that happen?
When was it filed? About 6 years ago.
6 years ago, so that would be 2011.
I believe, that's about 6 years ago, yes.
Okay, and,
I just want to be clear on that, though. The information in the packet looks like the judge's order is dated July of 2016. Are we talking about the same lawsuit?
Yep.
Okay.
It just took Judge Weiner quite a while to move through that situation.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to be clear on that point.
so, so it was 6 years ago it started, which would take us back to 2011. And that started because you were raising rents on some of the apartments, all of the apartments at that time? I mean, that's part of what the lawsuit was about.
I think the primary money issue in the lawsuit was whether or not we were required to pay moving expenses to people that moved of their own volition and had nothing to do with the conversion to condominium. That was the big money. One of the other issues was for new tenants coming in, people that were not impacted. You see, originally there were tenants there that thought they were living in an apartment building. And then you apply for your condominium conversion, and there's a lot of them the theory is there's some of them that would go, well, I don't want to live in a condominium, I'm going to have to move, or I'm going to get kicked out, I'm going to have to move. Those people that were there at the time the condominium conversion notices were sent out would be entitled to relocation expenses if they were moving because of the conversion. It was the position of the plaintiffs that people that came in 2, 3, 4 years later, new tenants, that knew full well, because it's right in the lease documents, that they were moving into a condominium, that they were not subject to the rent increase. And that was one of the issues before the court. And the court turned around and said, no, all rent increases, period, until you actually sell, are subject to planning commission approval.
But you were able to rent them at market rate at that point in time that those new tenants came in. If somebody voluntarily left their apartment, then the condo association could then rent that unit at the current market rate without coming to us. Is that correct?
Yes.
So that's one thing. What I'm seeing right now is that roughly 20% are people who were originally there when the planning commission approved the original condo conversion.
I believe your percentage of units that have turned over in the interim is pretty accurate.
So there's 80% that at some point have had some rent increase. So you haven't lost all of the money, you've lost some in terms of staying in market.
Well, the answer is yes and no, insofar as somebody that moved in, say, in 2010, with a bump up in rent, they have not had a rent increase since 2010.
Yeah, I get that it graduates over when somebody actually came in. So, but in terms of what I'm trying to get at and want to be clear about is not all of the tenants, in fact, only 20% of the tenants are still paying the rent that was in place back in 2008.
That is correct, and under our proposal, remember, it's 25% or market, whichever is less. If somebody moved in last year and they're very close to market, they're not getting a 25% increase. And what the market rents now are in Ms. Noss's report. Or what the market rents were a year ago is in Ms. Noss's report.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Looks like Commissioner Gordon, you had some additional questions?
No, actually, I was ready to begin deliberations, and I had something to say with respect to our commission deliberations.
Actually, I'd like to just ask one question, I'm sorry, before that happens. The county housing department has been out, I guess, at some point in the past to look at this particular project. Can you, when was the housing, can you remind us when the county housing department was last out there?
The last report we have is from February that says no violations were observed.
So no violations were observed as of February. Thank you. Okay, I'll go ahead and ask Commissioner Gordon then to go ahead and kick us off.
Okay, thanks, Chair. All right, so thank you for the applicant for coming out, or applicant's representative. Thank you for the members of the public to come out, and to the woman who spoke. So I'll kick this off. There's so many issues going on in terms of our analysis, and I'm going to try to keep it very simple. We're just reviewing the request for the rent increase under the code. We've got 3 prongs to guide us, and I'll just go through them. The prevailing rents for similar units is number 1, and I think it's pretty clear from the data that prevailing rents for units that are in, this just dawned on me, and the lawyers on the dais will appreciate this, but the word similar is troublesome. Prevailing rents for similar units, because that begs the question of the third prong, which is the conditions of the unit. So I'm going to say that those are both connected. Prevailing rents that were surveyed in the area show that the current rents being charged by the applicant are at least 25% below market. Going to the second prong, I think we've already determined that that's just a very, very, that doesn't give us enough data, since we only have hard data on the most recent year, and I'm not comfortable with extrapolating. So that brings us to the third the third prong, which is the condition of the unit, and the information that the subcommittee reported to the commission shows to me that from what we saw, we're not talking about units that are in tip-top shape. In fairness to the applicant, we're not, we're not talking about a large representative sample. I think we talked about that already. But from what we did see, it's clear to me that the conditions of the unit from the subcommittee report do not suggest that we should use the surveys as a fair benchmark, since I assume that the surveys are likely assuming a reasonable condition of the units. So because of that, I'm not inclined to, at this time, consider a 25% increase. And I'm interested in thinking about this somewhat creatively. I would be inclined to, I would be in favor of some increase now, and then taking a look at the conditions of the unit at a later date to see if the balance of the 25% would be granted. That's my preliminary thought.
Thank you. Commissioner Campbell.
Yeah, I generally agree with Commissioner Gordon's sentiments. I was on the Planning Commission in 2008 when we approved this plan, this condo conversion plan, and recall a lot of tenants coming up and speaking about it and being concerned, but we got a plan in place, and then that plan wasn't followed through with, and so there's been a lot of uncertainty over the years, but I see the need for a rent increase over at some point. Landlords need the money to upkeep their property, but I think it's a little unfair to ask for 25% in one fell swoop, considering the length of time that they didn't ask for one. And so I just think it's too much, too fast, especially when it's not the tenant's fault that the condo conversion plan that we approved in 2008 wasn't followed through with. That was apparently the owner's decision in response to the recession. So something less, I think, is appropriate. And there I'm stuck with a kind of a lack of data as to what that might be, and I agree it's hard to make the case on similar units because these units aren't exactly in the best shape. Having known a lot of landlords, been a landlord shortly myself, when you go to ask for a rent increase, you break out the bucket of paint and make it look nice. And if we were talking about the interiors only, it's a small sample, I agree. Potentially, maybe not representative, it's hard to say. But the exterior certainly could have kind of, I think, reflects a general lack of attendance to the upkeep. So that's where I'm kind of am right now.
Thank you. I guess I'll share my perspective on it. I agree with what my fellow commissioners have stated so far. I am generally of the view that property owners should be able to charge what the market will bear for the property they own. And having said that, obviously we have the factors that the ordinance lays forth, including condition of units. I want to note that the Housing Department has been out and found no violations, which is, of course, a different question from whether or not the property is in a condition that's analogous or similar to other properties in the community. That said, not having had significant rent increases over time is going to affect, I think, to some extent, the condition of at least the exterior. I don't know what to think about the interiors except for what I've heard from the subcommittee. I have no reason to doubt the credibility or the detail that's been brought to us by the subcommittee, but that's a very small subset. And we've had some people who've, without any particular sort of reason to be less than credible, told us that the property has been, they've had a better experience with management. So I think that there's evidence that lies on either side of this, but as I said last this matter was considered, I'm not comfortable with the proposition that 25% to market at one time is appropriate under the circumstances. With all deference and respect to Mr. Hazlip, I think that we ought to consider some of the equities involved here as we consider this matter. I myself think that 25% to market is an appropriate amount, given the information in the record. That said, I think that something over a couple of years, frankly, makes some sense. I'm not sure. I think 3 years is rather long. I think maybe half of it now and half of it a year or so out, maybe at 10 or 12% now, and the balance of it in an out year would be an appropriate way to proceed. That's at least how I'm seeing it right now. Commissioner Behringer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, I guess my perspective on this has changed substantially from the last time we talked about it, primarily because we went out and did an inspection of the property. Had I not done that, I might have come to a slightly different conclusion. And because at the last hearing, I asked the question, I'm not really sure what their end game is. I'm not sure if they're going to convert it to condos. We never got a commitment to do it. We certainly never got a timeline. So I'm operating under the assumption they're going to be landlords for the foreseeable future, and they're going to operate as apartment owners. If down the road they somehow figure out a way to convert it and market it as a condo project, then God bless them, they can proceed on that basis. I'm also taking into consideration the condition of the property, and I see on an exterior basis, and again, we were only in 2 units. We could have, seen more possibly, but when you look at the overall condition compared to other properties, it clearly, it comes up short by comparison. So I don't know that we can justify a rent increase based on the condition. I mean, if we have a 3-pronged approach that we have to take into consideration, the condition of the property is the one that I think certainly is obvious. Trying to quantify it becomes a little more complex because you're trying to, as you said, compare it to similar properties. And then we start down that rabbit hole of what does that mean and what's similar and how similar or dissimilar are they. And we can't tie any rent increases toward, nor do we have any assurances that if they did have an additional revenue stream, that would be put back into the property so that the conditions would improve. If I had some way to condition that, I would be more comfortable with maybe a slightly more aggressive rent increase. But based on an 8 or a 9 or a 10-year run of what looks to be mediocre to poor maintenance, I'm not even sure how that would work out. And then finally, as I said last time, I don't even understand why we as a planning commission are talking about what rents people should be charging on their property. That to me is a policy matter, should be decided by our erstwhile council. And I'm thinking that's where this is probably going to end up anyway. So, thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Gordon.
I just realized that Commissioner Clifford has not had a chance to speak.
Well, there's his light. We'll go ahead and...
I was waiting for Commissioner Behringer to finish.
Finish my rant.
I'll defer to Commissioner.
You can go right ahead, and then I can speak. I'm not in love with the sound of my voice, so go ahead.
All right, it's a quick point. In response to Commissioner Behringer's, you said that you'd be much more comfortable with a result that tied a future rent increase with some tangible improvement
Right,
in the unit.
which our attorney has told us we cannot do.
That's correct. However, I think my initial notion was to approve a partial rent increase now with the notion that a subsequent increase would be approvable upon a review of the 3 prongs, again, one of the prongs being the condition of the unit. Did you follow that?
Yeah, I do, but by this discussion, are we creating a form substance issue, Counselor?
Can you please repeat your?
Give us your proposal again. What exactly are you talking about?
So what I'm contemplating is an outcome where we grant a portion, for example, Chair Niblin's numbers, like maybe half of it now, and the balance at a subsequent time in the future, say in a year's time or in 18 months' time, subject to a finding that the three prongs still support that rate, that increase of the balance.
So you're either doing one of two things there. You're either conditioning the project with the improvements, or you're requiring that the applicant come back to the Planning Commission for a new determination in which the finding that you referenced is made. So I think that the latter is what is already contemplated in the ordinance. And the former would be conditioning the project, which we are not going to do tonight with respect to conditions that go beyond the actual.
Right, so you're saying that I can do that, so number 2 is okay, but number 1 is not?
Yeah, and number 2 is really just having them come back,
File a new
right?
application.
It's just filing a new application and requiring that a finding be made. Requiring that a finding be made would be binding a future planning commission to conditions that are not contemplated in the ordinance. And so it's not something that I would recommend you do.
So in other words, what I could do is simply,
You could direct them to come back with a new application in a period of time.
right,
And you can put on the record that, you know, the planning commission, as it sits today, will consider the condition of the units at that time and determining whether the future rent increase would be authorized by the planning commission.
yeah.
But effectively, we're just talking about filing another application. We're going to approve X tonight because we believe the record supports X. If you want more, come back later.
That's exactly right.
That's helpful.
In theory.
Commissioner Clifford, I'm in love with your voice, so I'd like to hear it.
Well, thank you very much for that. That was one of my questions that I was going to ask again. The other side of that question is, could we possibly let the applicant come back with a plan for the use of a percentage of any increase we give them that is actually documented and applied to improving what we want to have improved, and therefore, everybody would benefit. They would get their rent increase.
It's too complicated.
The tenants would get better conditions to live in, and everything would be a done deal kind of situation. But it would have to be something coming from the applicant, not coming from the commission in terms of a plan on how to accomplish that.
So again, I think that is adding a condition to your approval, or alternatively, it would be a non-formal direction, not in the form of a resolution or a formal action, asking the applicant to come back at a future date with a subsequent application.
Well,
Okay. Then I'm going to say that I would consider a lesser amount at this point in time, and then just have them come back when they're, a year or so from now. I also do share concerns that based on what I saw it has clearly been a lot of years since any substantial maintenance has been done on the overall complex. And I'll leave it at that for now.
Commissioner Campbell.
Just to make sure I have it right. What if we just said 10%'s right tonight?
Acceptable.
And then just left it at that, and then a year from now, they decide, that's too low, I want to come back.
Yeah, the ordinance vests the planning commission with the discretion to determine whether the rent increase proposed is appropriate. And that necessarily implies that a lesser rent increase may be determined to be appropriate by the planning commission. That's precisely what you're doing if you say 10%.
And nothing stops the applicant on their own initiative a year from now from coming back.
That's right, and nothing stops the applicant from coming back with an application with different components, such as the ones that they've proposed today. Some of the features of their application are not required by the ordinance.
Right. And then my only concern is where does that 10% number derive from? That's the only issue.
It's
Not a
actually a
small
good
one.
issue. It's an important issue. I mean,
But that's how, if we can get at a number that's grounded in data and fact, that's the way I would handle it.
Well, I'm sorry, Commissioner. And I'd like to add that we would like you to direct staff to return with additional recitals or language if you are going to change the 10% that establishes the basis for, I'm sorry, if you're going to change 25%, it establishes the basis for your determination.
okay. Do we have any additional discussion or comment with respect to Commissioner Campbell's input? It sounds like that's one possible way ahead. My own thinking was that I could see a discount from the 25%. I believe there's really good, to the extent that, we have market data, I think it does reflect, frankly, that 25% is not an unreasonable number given the amount of time, putting aside, the amount of time that's passed and, whether folks should have moved with this diligence or that diligence. I think 25% is a reasonable figure, or market, whichever is the lower. And I do see and I understand my colleagues' perspective with respect to some discount being appropriate given the conditions of the unit. I think that of the project as a whole, I think that some of the numbers we're talking about seem kind of an extreme by way of a discount. I was thinking perhaps as I was listening that maybe a 20% cap might be appropriate, allocated over a couple of years. Might be something I would be comfortable with tonight, so that we had 10% immediately, 10% 12 months 12 months thereafter, and if, in the interim, there was a thought that, more was, a higher rent level was appropriate, the applicant could file an application at that time, but that's kind of where I'm sitting right now.
I like that approach, and I guess my only concern, you didn't call me, sorry, but my only concern is if the conditions don't improve, and then that next 10% is automatic in year two.
Right, that would.
And I don't want to condition anything.
Right, that would require us to be okay with the proposition that 20% is appropriate today. And I recognize that people may
Exactly.
not share that view, but
Right.
that's mine.
Right.
Commissioner Gordon.
I like Commissioner Campbell's suggestion, and I like Chair Niblin's suggestion. I'm kind of in a slightly different place. I'd be comfortable cutting, the applicant requested 25%. I would be comfortable cutting that in half and just granting, 12.5% now. And if the applicant wants to come back and ask for more, I'm absolutely open to that.
If that was a motion, I'd second it, just for sake of conversation.
Okay. All right. Does staff have any input on my motion, on my proposed motion, in terms of grounding it and?
And do we need to bring this back? I guess I want to go back to what the,
The planning director alerted me that I misspoke. We had discussed earlier and agreed that it doesn't need to return. We want direction from you on some additional recitals that you might deem appropriate if you are going to change the 25% amount. And if you can give us general direction, we will review the minutes of the meeting, craft that additional language from you, and then we would amend the resolution, paragraph 1A, to reflect the percentage increase that you directed.
I'm guessing some of the whereas clauses would probably go in the area of the work that the subcommittee did with respect to establishing the condition of the premises, both with respect to the the common areas and the units that were actually subject to being looked at. Sort of the information that we received in the supplemental staff report about, how this project relates to other projects in Pacifica. I'm thinking we would probably be concerned about the impact of an increase like the increase that we were talking about we had some inclination to have spread it over time in any event, so that this, in some sense, addresses those concerns. I'm thinking Commissioner Cooper, or I'm sorry, that Commissioner Clifford might have some additional thoughts.
Well, one of my thoughts about a 12.5% is that there are actually some tenants that would qualify for a 10% increase only. And
Correct. So we'd have or market tied to that, right?
so, well, that would be the 62 and over at a certain time, and/or the disabled that are part of the proposal.
Okay.
So I'm concerned about going to 12.5% when those people currently, under what we've got in front of us, would only get a 10% increase over the time.
The way I would interpret the action was that any change to the 25% would apply to recital 1A, but not amend recital 1C, which separately provides that tenants who are over age 62 on August 14th, 2014, et cetera, will not have their rent increase more than 10%. So that would still apply.
So that would still exist?
Yes.
Okay. All right. I just wanted to clear that up.
Thanks for raising that, of course. Commissioner Campbell?
I just want to kind of get on the record that this would be so much easier if the exterior of the building, or if the building was in good shape, because then we could really make that similar like-kind comparison, and so we just don't have that here, and that makes it hard. Just a question for council, because we don't have that ability. I mean, if we pick a number, 12.5%, 10%, how busy are we going to make you if that's challenged? I mean, if we're just picking a number.
The record should support the number that you pick, and you have been provided with certain evidence regarding similar rents in comparable properties. And so you are stuck with the determination as to what amount is warranted, given what the record shows regarding comparable properties.
We've got the best available data. I mean, we got sufficient data to make this decision tonight, is what you're saying.
Yes.
I don't think so.
Commissioner Barron, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I don't agree with that. I don't think we have the data that we can make a strong case for how we come down on this, whether it's 10% or 12.5 or 13 or 14. I really don't, because I think at the core of it, if you're looking at it just from a analytical standpoint and putting aside the emotionals and subjectivity of what the condition might be, I don't know that you can compare it, but if you stand in the street and you look at the ones on one side of the road and you look at the ones on the other side of the road, and they don't compare favorably, so then the next question is, what data do you have that you can justify discounting from what the ones on the better condition units are? I just don't know how you can do that. I think at the end of the day, we're going to come up as a group with a number, and then the applicant's going to have to decide how he wants to proceed, right?
Yeah, and let's not stray too far from what we know about this ordinance, which is that it contains subjective criteria.
Correct.
And so it certainly requires a measured and subjective approach to what is appropriate, given the record before you. And when I suggest that there is sufficient evidence to make a determination, there is sufficient evidence based on the language of the ordinance, which is quite broad.
Thank
Okay,
you.
maybe I misunderstood. I thought you were saying there's enough data there for us to do the calculus and come up with a number that can be supported other than just a subjective viewpoint.
Well, I'm suggesting that the ordinance that's before you would have you utilize the data that's before you to make your determination, and
I
this is not a
understand.
facial challenge to the ordinance. The ordinance is as it's drafted, and
I understand. Okay.
Commissioner Gordon?
All right, I'm going to try to make this simple again, because I think it is simple. The ordinance says 3 prongs. One of the prongs is condition of the unit. We had a subcommittee go out, take photographs, do inspections, on-site inspections, and give us a report. I mean, I think that's objective data on which you can base a finding. I came in here with the idea, with the notion of I was very open-minded to the application. When you guys presented that slideshow, I was taken aback, and it was hard to watch, honestly. So I feel like we should slash the application's request in half, given the evidence that went to the 3rd prong. I think that's supportable, and I'm comfortable with it.
Commissioner Campbell?
I'm comfortable with that.
Okay. Commissioner Gordon?
I'll make a motion.
Go ahead.
God,
may
help me.
I?
Please help me.
I would like to see if I can accurately capture what you just stated with respect to adding something to the resolution. So perhaps you might direct us to add a recital which states that whereas the Planning Commission considered the condition of the property and the prevailing rents for similar units and determined that based upon the record showing the condition of the property and prevailing rents for similar units, a rent increase of 25% is not warranted.
I think that would be an appropriate, or those would be some appropriate findings. So, yeah.
Then in your motion, if you can please reference the change to paragraph 1A of the resolution.
Why don't someone else make the motion? I don't have the packet, the full packet. I printed out excerpts, so I'm
I
handy.
can try to help you craft a
Oh, here we
motion
go.
too, if that'll help you. Okay.
All right.
So do you want to go ahead and make a motion that I guess, again, it sounds like your motion is that we adopt the resolution included on page 95 at SEC of the packet to include the additional findings that our Deputy City Attorney just articulated for us. Amending, however, paragraph 1A of the resolution such that existing tenants may experience rent increase of up to, was it 12.5% or up to market rate, whichever is less. Existing tenants with month-to-month leases will not experience no rent increase for at least 1 year. So the change in that paragraph is from 25% to 12.5%. And we believe that the rest, I'm believing the rest of the resolution, at least paragraph 1 of the resolution, remains unchanged, and frankly, the balance of the resolution remains unchanged. That's the motion, that we proceed that way, I think.
So moved.
Okay, I've got a motion. Is there a second? Commissioner Clifford.
I will second that motion.
Okay, so we have a motion and a second. I'll ask that we just go ahead and vote on that. Okay, well, that's unanimous then, 5 votes in favor. Thank you. So that will then take us to item 2, continued public hearing, text amendment TA 10517, initiated by the City of Pacifica to amend various Pacifica Municipal Code provisions to conform to amendments enacted by the California Legislature to Government Code Section 65852.2 concerning accessory dwelling units, second residential units permitted by local agencies. The amendments to be considered would affect residential property citywide. The recommended CEQA action is statutory exemption, CEQA guidelines section 15282 sub H, and general rule exemption, CEQA guidelines section 15061B3. The staff's recommended action on this matter is to adopt the attached resolution initiating the text amendment and recommending approval of the City Council.
I'll go get it.
I think this will take us to staff report.
Christian will be right up.
Thank you.
Question.
Good evening, Honorable Chair and Commissioners. I'm Associate Planner Christian Murdoch. This evening, we are holding a continued public hearing to initiate a text amendment to the Pacifica Municipal Code related to rezoning provisions for accessory dwelling unit or ADU construction. ADU is the term used in state law and in the proposed ordinance to refer to what are more commonly known as second units, in-law units, or granny flats. Staff has prepared the proposed ordinance in compliance with recent changes in state law. The California Legislature in 2016 enacted Assembly Bill 2299 and Senate Bill 1069, amending Government Code Section 65852.2 pertaining to local government regulation of ADU construction. The bills established more permissive standards for ADU construction that serve as the maximum standards local governments may apply. They contain many specific provisions limiting local control, notable among them rendering null and void any inconsistent provisions of local ordinances regulating ADU construction that do not comply with the state law, requiring a ministerial process for approval of ADU applications, except within the coastal zone where the city may still require a coastal development permit, eliminating off-street parking requirements for ADUs meeting certain criteria, including location within 1/2 mile of transit and ADUs created within an existing primary dwelling unit or accessory structure, providing that garage demolition or conversion is permissible to enable ADU construction, and permitting the city in certain cases to require replacement of parking spaces, requiring the city to permit tandem parking to satisfy off-street parking requirements, requiring the city to allow an ADU as small as 150 square feet if it meets the definition of an efficiency unit under the Health and Safety Code, and prohibiting the city from requiring fire sprinklers if they are not required for the primary dwelling unit. There are numerous provisions in the city's existing ordinance that are now inconsistent with state law, which makes it important for the city to enact an updated ordinance in a timely manner. The ordinance staff presented to the Planning Commission on April 17th included several items discussed by the Planning Commission at its ADU ordinance study session on March 20th. Among them were provisions to prohibit doors, windows, and other openings facing the property line for ADUs constructed or converted within the minimum side and rear setbacks, while still allowing skylights and similar roof-mounted openings to provide natural light within the units. To require ADU height to be equal to or less than the existing primary dwelling unit. To include a 2-tier parking requirement based on the number of bedrooms in the ADU, and to require replacement of garage parking spaces whenever a garage is demolished or converted to create an ADU when the ADU is otherwise exempt from providing off-street parking. Despite its earlier consideration of ADU regulations at the study session, the Planning Commission was unable to garner 4 votes recommending approval of the ordinance as drafted on April 17th. The Commission's deliberations at that meeting focused on a handful of topics. They included owner occupancy of a site containing an ADU, use of ADUs for short-term rental accommodations such as Airbnb, providing a public notification and appeals process for ADU building permit applications, concerns about ADU construction in certain neighborhoods with perceived parking issues, and ensuring the transit maps reflect active bus stops. Staff has revised the proposed ordinance in response to Commission feedback from the April 17th hearing on those items where a majority of the Commission expressed a clear position. Of note, staff changed the proposed ordinance to require owner occupancy of a primary dwelling unit at the time of a building permit application to construct an ADU, as well as on a continuing basis while the ADU is occupied by a tenant, and to require a transit stop to be serviced each day of the week to be considered for the parking exemption. Staff updated the map of parking exempt areas to reflect the change in definition, which dramatically changed the exempt areas in Lindemar and Park Pacifica. The revised map is included as attachment H. No change to the proposed ordinance was required to prohibit short-term rental of an ADU for a period less than 30 days because the previous draft already contained a prohibition on this activity. For the remaining items discussed on April 17th, after careful consideration, staff decided not to make changes to the proposed ordinance. The changes that were discussed but not incorporated into the draft before you included requirement to provide public notification and appeals process for ADU building permit applications because such a change would create a burden for applicants in terms of time and cost without a corresponding benefit to the review process. The Commission would be unable to exercise discretion on ADU applications brought before it, except for certain limited discretion on projects in the coastal zone. And provisions to address perceived parking impacts from ADU construction were not included in the draft ordinance. As noted in the staff report, parking exemptions are explicitly provided in state law for certain ADU types and ADUs in certain locations. Limited discretion related to parking can only be exercised for sites within the coastal zone. Otherwise, the ordinance must consider factors which, applied generally throughout the city, would determine where ADUs may and may not be constructed. Because such a standard would constitute a significant policy position, staff felt more appropriate for the commission to discuss this option at the public hearing. In addition to those topics raised during the commission's deliberations, Planning Director Weremeister promised a comprehensive review of the proposed ordinance at the end of the last public hearing to identify any additional areas where the Planning Commission could apply local discretion in the ADU ordinance. Staff identified 3 such areas the commission may consider incorporating into the proposed ordinance, which I will outline briefly. They are discussed more fully in the staff report. I hope the commission will consider deliberating on these items specifically after receiving public comment. The first is requiring a primary dwelling unit to meet the minimum off-street parking requirement in order to be eligible for ADU construction. Because ADUs may only be constructed at sites with existing single-family homes, this would mean the existing single-family residence must have a 2-car garage with side-by-side configuration with minimum interior dimensions of 18 feet wide by 19 feet deep. As the commission may be aware, there are many homes throughout Pacifica, particularly in our older neighborhoods, which have either a 1-car garage or no garage at all. Even in newer parts of the city, many 2-car garages do not comply with the minimum dimensions required in the zoning standards. The second item was increasing the minimum distance between structures beyond the 5-foot requirement currently in the proposed ordinance. Staff identified a 10-foot separation to be comparable to the minimum separation required between primary dwelling units on adjacent lots. And the third item identified was establishing a maximum floor area for detached accessory dwelling units less than the 1,200 square foot maximum described in state law and currently included in the proposed ordinance. Staff does not recommend incorporating such a limit, although there may be some justification for doing so as described in the memorandum from the California Department of Housing and Community Development included as Attachment I. In each of these cases, should the commission desire to incorporate such provisions into the proposed ordinance, staff suggests considering whether strict compliance is necessary or whether a variance, minor modification, or parking exception may be acceptable to deviate from the standards. Staff's recommendation for allowing relief from these standards varies for each of them. And to cover a couple general matters, to make it clear, the commission is acting on a proposed ordinance which would affect residentially zoned properties throughout the city. It would regulate construction of ADUs on any residentially zoned property containing an existing single-family residence. And with respect to environmental review, the proposed ordinance is not subject to environmental review because it qualifies for a statutory exemption under the California Environmental Quality Act guidelines section 15282H. And additionally, the various amendments to other zoning provisions to assure consistency with the ADU ordinance are not subject to environmental review because it can be seen with certainty that there is no possibility that the amendments, which are administrative in nature, will have a significant effect on the environment. In closing, staff requests that after receiving public comment and deliberating, the Planning Commission adopt the resolution included as Attachment A, which initiates the text amendment and recommends approval to the City Council. Because the item before you is related to a legislative action, in this case an ordinance to amend the text of the city's zoning regulations, an affirmative vote of at least 4 commissioners is required to recommend approval to City Council. Any lesser vote would be considered a recommendation to deny the text amendment. Thank you, and that concludes my presentation. Thank you, Mr. Murdoch. Are there any questions for Mr. Murdoch before we open the public hearing? Okay, I don't see any. I'm going to go ahead and open the public hearing. I don't have any speaker cards, so if there's anybody who wants to speak to this matter, please bring your card up, and we'll go ahead and, looks like we have a couple. And maybe you could give your card to staff.
Yep. Thank you for letting me speak.
Maybe you could state your name just for the record if you wouldn't
I'm sorry,
mind.
Alfred Tetzner. I live in Pacifica.
Thank you, Mr. Tetzner.
And I'm here to comment on the ADU and associated parking problems that might be part of that. Sorry, these are all bullet points. I wasn't really prepared to be here tonight, but when I built my property, I did a massive remodel on a house, and I was required by the city to put in off-street parking as part of my permit process for 2 people living on that property. As I look around my neighborhood, I see at least 2 neighbors who have built illegal in-laws units. As part of the Fairmont Association CCNRs, that's not proper, it's not legal, yet they still do it. And associated with just one property, there are at least 7 cars on the street. Associated with another property right across the street, who has 2 tenants, there's 4 cars on the street. They very rarely, if at all, use their garages to park their cars. And as the street is narrow, it's almost impossible, I believe, to get a fire truck down those streets. And with the excessive parking now, it'd probably be impossible. Is the city ready to do anything about that? Let's see. The one person across the street is actually building a permitted exercise room, which with complete decking, which I believe will have a few tenants living in it, if you approve this. We also laugh at the street sweeper who makes his way down the center of the street, never touching curbs. At this point, there's somewhere you could save some money by cutting it on my street. In the previous residence I had, which was just up the street, I had one person who actually had 9 roommates, double parking on a court. I couldn't get my car in and out of my own garage. And that's what I see in my future if you allow this to actually happen. What I would like to do is request that you make anybody who has the additional ADU that you permit provide off-street parking, at least 2 cars for every bedroom. Might be something that might be a good idea. Make it a requirement, please. I mean, if you can get them off the street, that would be a wonderful thing. And also, I'd be very concerned or curious as to how this is going to affect the FARs, setbacks, height allowances. The one property across the street that I mentioned has a connecting foundation from the main property down to the bottom. And if the foundation is connected, does that actually make it, does that allow for a height variation?
Thank you, sir.
Which is at least 20 feet, by the way, more than any other height allowances in the neighborhood.
Thank you, sir. Rochelle St. Onge.
Evening. Rochelle St. Ange.
Ange, I'm sorry.
Ange, it's okay. I live on Heathcliff Drive in Manor. I've been living there for 14 years. I submitted my application for the accessory dwelling unit last May 24th. When the state passed SB 1069, it was an answered prayer for my family's financial need. See, I'm a single parent, and cost of living in the Bay Area has been rising and making it difficult for family with dual income and even harder for family with one like myself. So when I'm having an ADU in my property will provide rental income that will tremendously help my family as well as benefit the community's housing demand. I understand that majority of the concern is about street parking. I've been living on Heathcliff, like I said, for 14 years, and parking has never been an issue. I have neighbors who has 2 to 3 cars per household, and still, there's still plenty of street parking. I actually took pictures, if you guys would like to review them, of different times, different days of my street, and there are plenty of street parkings. I understand that I'm sorry, I'm nervous. I understand that my house is one of the old houses that's non-conforming. It only has 1-car garage. And I know that they are suggesting a minimum of 2-space requirement. But, based on the design of my house, that's not possible. So I hope that you'll take into consideration a driveway as a second parking. And also, I just want to add that the ADU that I'm adding, it's small. It's only comfortable for one person. So even if, let's say my future tenant does have 1 vehicle, it's not really going to, change the parking situation in my neighborhood. And I know you also may be concerned that approving this ADU may set precedents. And it could be challenging for neighborhoods with parking that's difficult or problematic, but I think that should be reviewed on a case-by-case basis. And lastly, in regards to public transportation, there is a bus stop less than a quarter mile from my house, and it's Samtrans Line 16, 121, and 140, and they do operate on a daily basis. That's all, and thank you, and I hope you take my concerns into consideration.
Thank you, Ms. Orange.
And I don't know if you guys want to look at the pictures.
If you want to submit those, of course, those can become a part of the record if you care to, and we'll, of course, look at them.
Thank you.
Thank you. I don't have any other speaker cards, so seeing no one else who's interested in speaking, I'll go ahead and close the public hearing and bring this back to the commission. And I had an initial thought, we did have 4 or 5 items that were matters that were sort of bringbacks and follow-ups, and I was wondering if it would be possible as a commission to sort of just get a sense of whether or not we're comfortable with what staff has done with respect to those particular items, so that we can maybe focus on the 3 particular items under subsection F of the memo. So I guess it's A through E, how we feel about just moving, just accepting those for putting a tack in those and moving on. Commissioner Clifford.
Well, the only one I had some concerns about were the transit map. And I greatly appreciate what you have done, but I somehow managed to leave that part of my packet at home. So at any rate, I do remember that there were several parts of it where there was only one bus a day, and I'm concerned that that might be too small to use, is saying that yes, we can go ahead and allow the AUDs
ADUs
in place in those areas.
Would you
Because they don't, the bus service being once a day isn't really significant.
Were you referring to the table that had the sort of the school days, for example, that reflected maybe 3 runs? I don't know that any that were just 1, but.
Sure. So I would first respond by saying that the standard that we've drafted requires daily bus service. And we established a very low threshold because we are walking a fine line. The state law does not expressly allow us to establish service levels for public transit. And what limited information we have suggests that the legislative author of the state law, one of them, indicated that he was not in favor of allowing local agencies to set service level standards. So we've taken what I think is a very sensible and appropriate step by saying for transit to be transit, there needs to be transit. So it needs to be there every day. It can't be this selective service, school year only or weekday only. If the presumption is that people are relying on public transit and don't need an automobile, then there needs to be transit every day. The service levels that we identified by studying the Samtrans bus routes that serve Pacifica noted a handful, I believe there were 5 daily bus routes. So Monday through Sunday, there's service all year long. The lowest service level that we identified was 15 buses per day. And only those bus routes, the 15 buses per day or greater, were counted in the definition as we've drafted it, because all of the other bus routes that may have 3 trips per day, for instance, that are school routes, don't run year-round. They only run during the school year. And so on that basis, they were not mapped and would not be resulting in parking exemptions for ADUs proposed in those areas.
That's helpful. Thank you very much. I apologize for somehow managing to leave that one document.
Commissioner Campbell.
I was going to go along with your proposal. I'll bring my comments up later.
Okay,
Or
excellent.
questions later.
Yeah, I only had, frankly, one comment with respect to the first 5 items, A through E. I myself am of the view that if there's weekday service, that probably, in my view, is adequate to, frankly, qualify for service within the meaning of what the government code articulates. And I believe we ought to be considering weekday service. I think people could rely on a weekday bus and make other arrangements for weekends, just on average. I know that everybody's circumstances are a little different, but I'm frankly not as comfortable excluding the weekday routes. But that's just my perspective, particularly the one that looks like there are 16 buses per day on it, just doesn't seem to me appropriate to exclude it, but just my sense. Commissioner Behringer?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess I was going to give my comments before you start in on the A through E exercise, because I've really not changed my position on this. I think it's hugely flawed. It basically wipes out single-family zoning in our community. We've had no say-so about it. We've had no hearings on it. The state legislature has enacted this to solve a problem that's statewide without any thought or consideration to the character of local jurisdictions and how it might impact them. In my mind, if someone buys a single-family home in Lindemar, and now all of a sudden it's a two-on-a-lot or a multifamily neighborhood, that changes the entire character of the investment, and I'm fundamentally opposed to it. And I think the problem is that down the road, by the time the full impact of this little adventure comes full circle, it's going to be a lot of problems, and they're permanent structures. This isn't something we can unwind quickly. So I'm opposed to it. I've gone on record as saying I think we should oppose it, we should fight it, we should say no. If there's litigation, we should proceed on that. I don't know how you're going to take into consideration the impact this is going to have on our infrastructure. I guarantee you there is a parking problem. While I'm sympathetic to individuals who, from a financial standpoint, would benefit from this and it's important to their lifestyle, I get that. But that's not how real estate development works in a residential environment. And we could be very well overburdening our water system, our sanitary and our storm sewer system, and I guarantee you there will be substantial adverse parking impacts by doing this. And more importantly, these projects will go forward without any public hearings. So you won't have an opportunity to weigh in on what your neighbor is going to do. And this is a city where we have elections on somebody wanting to build apartment buildings. So I don't understand why this has gotten as far as it has, other than the mantra of the state has enacted it, so therefore we've got to march like robots down the road and say yes to it. And I'm opposed to it, and I'm going to oppose it tonight. So there.
Commissioner Gordon?
It's hard to follow that, isn't it? Commissioner Behringer makes some good comments. First, I wanted to say to Christian, assistant planner? No, associate planner, right?
That's correct.
Associate Planner Murdoch. Your presentation tonight was incredibly helpful and thorough, and you continue to set the gold standard in terms of your analysis and presentation. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
I agree.
To Commissioner Behringer, I would say, I'm like 100% in agreement with you, but there is the matter of the law of preemption, and federal preempts state, state preempts local, we're on the short end of the stick. So I would encourage you, because you're a very creative guy, you've got a creative mind, try to think of ways to make this less bad. Anyway, and so that's where I'm headed right now.
So
I was going to say something, yeah.
please.
In terms of parking, because that's my biggest concern is I imagine neighborhoods like Pedro Point, where driving through these streets with cars parked everywhere, putting more cars parked there would make it practically impassable. And I see that with the modifications, or with your observations, that areas within the coastal zone will have some discretion to take into account impacts on parking, right? Street parking.
That's correct. I can elaborate somewhat if you'd like.
Sure.
To clarify the point. So in the coastal zone, the state law says expressly that nothing in the law about ADUs shall modify or otherwise affect the Coastal Act, except that coastal development permit applications shall not be subject to public hearings. So we've drafted the ordinance such that the planning director would consider the administrative coastal development permit, which would be required for an accessory dwelling unit. It would still involve a public notice. It just wouldn't be a public hearing. So a unique procedure of these permits would be a written comment period. So the public would have an opportunity to write in, indicate, we have XYZ issue with this. Perhaps it's parking, perhaps it's something else. The planning director would have an opportunity to evaluate that. And within the limited discretion provided, could weigh in making the findings for approval of the coastal development permit, and balancing all of the evidence. We have drafted 2 supplemental findings in addition to the regular CDP findings related to parking, and they are triggered if the accessory dwelling unit does not provide the off-street parking that would otherwise be required, were it not for some exemption, whether it's the transit exemption or created within the existing floor area exemption. If they're not providing off-street parking, then those additional findings come into play. So we think that that's a balanced approach. It gives people an option. If they can provide the parking, they're having a somewhat easier approval process. If they don't provide it because they're taking full advantage of what the law provides, then they have a higher threshold for the planning director's review. The circumstances are quite different outside of the coastal zone, as you're aware.
And so what you just said applies to the coastal zone, or you're saying that there's also, well, first of all, in terms of the coastal zone, would there be a notice requirement so that if there's an ADU application in the coastal zone, the neighbors get notice of it? Or?
Yes, and I should clarify, it's within the appeals zone of the coastal zone. So the way the ordinance is written, as the existing city code was written for accessory dwelling units, outside of the appeals zone of the coastal zone, which is a rather narrow segment, but it does include all of Pedro Point to address your specific concern. Outside of the appeals zone, as long as it meets all of the zoning standards, it can be exempt from the administrative CDP requirement, the coastal development permit, the public process. But within the coastal zone, appeal zone, including all of Pedro Point, sections of Sharp Park, the Fairmont neighborhood and so forth, that would require the public notification process and the written comment period and the discretionary review process.
When you said Fairmont,
there's a portion of the West Fairmont neighborhood in the very far north. I don't believe there's any homes that may be constructed there currently, but technically, it's within that neighborhood.
Okay, so it sounds like we've done as creatively as much as we possibly can to create some measure of review, even if it's not to the planning commission, it's at least to the director.
For the areas within the appeal zone of the coastal zone, yes. I think we have a much more conservative reading of the state law when it comes to areas that are not subject to coastal development permit requirements. We don't believe there's a way to impose a discretionary review process on those types of applications.
Thanks, Christian.
Commissioner Campbell.
Outside of the coastal zone, well, I was reading that California handbook for the first time because I don't think I'd seen that, and it did remark on the ability of cities to enact restrictions based on public health and safety.
I would say that's generally correct. There's a specific provision that comes to mind that talks about traffic flow and public safety. That's one dimension. There may be others that the city attorney can comment on.
And before you do, just because I think it may assist, I mean, I'm thinking like in Valamar, for example, where we have the major thoroughfare in the back of Valamar neighborhood, Reina del Mar, and it's restricted so that there's no parking on either side because the roadway is so narrow. And I think there's a lot of streets like that throughout the city where the streets are probably too narrow. What is the standard roadway width that was required in the city?
I believe the fire code requires 20 feet from curb to curb. In such cases, you cannot park on street. And so many of our existing streets in certain portions do not comply with that standard. The standards increase dramatically to provide for on-street parking. I don't remember specifically what those are, but something like 26 or 28 feet to park on one side and 32 or greater, something like that for parking on both sides. So it's a significant difference from the built condition in certain parts of Pacifica.
Okay. Now, that's where I was headed, because that, in Pacifica, in Valamar, that, we had that restriction because a fire truck couldn't get up once and somebody passed away. And, by the way, we need code enforcement on that street, but, is there a way to, and I guess this is a question for the attorney now, is there a way to, this is a hypothetical, but to say no ADUs on streets where the street doesn't meet minimum width requirements that the city has, and so there's a public health and safety issue that the city has even acknowledged, and we've even had one fatality because of it?
Yeah, so the state laws allow local agencies to designate areas where ADUs are allowed based on public safety and traffic flow. So if the commission were to make findings that determined that ADUs in a specific area impeded traffic flow or public safety, then you could limit ADUs in those areas.
That's promising.
So would that then be the commission setting some criteria? I mean, for example, Commissioner Campbell referencing streets with, beyond, below a certain threshold, or would it require a street-by-street assessment? What are you thinking?
So we could do it in either two ways. We could designate, we would either designate areas that it's permitted in the ordinance itself, in the ADU ordinance itself, and those designations would be based on, such as Commissioner Campbell suggested, size of a street and traffic flow capability in those streets, or the commission could consider limited overlay zones in which the zone the zone as a whole includes features that the commission finds to impede public health and safety.
Well, one of the concerns I have as we're having this conversation is that the law, at least some component of the law, contemplates at least the presumption that people occupying these units are going to be using public transit and therefore presumably not have vehicles. So I'm having a little bit of difficulty kind of squaring that presumption of the law with kind of relying on that particular provision of the government code that
Yeah.
we're talking about.
And if I may just add one more consideration, and I think your comment is well taken, the legislative intent of AB 2299-1069 is to allow as many ADUs as possible, and the HCD guidance memo supports that.
Right.
So designating areas where ADUs are impermissible based on traffic flow and public safety, there needs to be a very strong nexus between the record establishing that there will be public health and safety issues and prohibition on ADUs in that area. I was going to say, by way of example, another city that I've worked with on their ordinance restricted ADUs on one-way streets in which there were legal non-conforming lot sizes that were smaller than the standard lot sizes, knowing, and this particular street was not in an area in which public transportation was located. And so they could make findings that definitively, or they believe to definitively establish it would create health and safety concerns related to law enforcement and public safety equipment not being able to make their way through the narrow street.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Campbell.
Yeah, so, I mean, thank you, because I think that the presumption we need to take seriously, and so I was kind of curious, and you provided one example of how to rebut the presumption. And so I guess maybe that is one evidentiary factor that we could take into account, is whether these streets could get emergency vehicles through them, considering their width, if they've got cars parked on both sides. I mean, can we talk about that in the context of real-world scenarios, or do you just look at the street without the cars parked on both sides? Maybe that's a little confusing, but
I'd probably leave that to you.
I didn't understand the question.
Yeah, actually, I'm going to withdraw that, because that'd just be too hard. But I do think that I feel like we should explore this. Can we rebut the presumption, considering some of the streets in Pacifica really are so narrow? I'm thinking Valamar, Pedro Point, Rockaway, that really, and they're filled with substandard lots, which is interesting that you mentioned that. That there might be enough evidentiary basis there to push back on the ADUs on those streets, because personally, I do think that if you do allow the ADUs on those narrow streets, yeah, people are going to be supposedly taking public transit from a half mile away. Okay, wink, wink, nod, nod. That's really not going to happen. But I guess we have to assume it's going to happen. That's the presumption. But I do think that even with that, we've got some increased element of, even if it's de minimis at this point, element of a safety issue. Considering, even right now, without the ADUs, we have issues where I dare you to get an emergency vehicle up some of these streets right now. So I wouldn't want to make it worse. I certainly wouldn't want that, not explored. So I just wonder if there's a way to explore that.
I believe there is. I think as staff, we would hope that there's a clear understanding of the counter policy considerations for allowing ADUs in as many places as possible, for reasons not least of which include trying to provide more affordable housing for people in this current environment. And so to do such an analysis would have an exclusionary effect over large portions of the city potentially, and it may even have the effect of prohibiting ADUs throughout nearly the entire city. And so we haven't performed that analysis yet. The proposal that we had in the next section that the commission will deliberate about requiring the primary dwelling unit to meet the off-street parking requirement, our analysis was based on traffic flow. We didn't analyze it from a public safety standpoint per se, in the same fashion that you're advocating an analysis for fire access and first responder access. So that's an analysis we haven't performed yet.
Commissioner Behringer.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'm sorry.
City Attorney was about to say something. I just was hoping we could.
I'm sorry. I wanted to add to make clear that we are all on the same page, that this conversation about public health and safety and traffic flow only applies to attached and detached ADUs. ADUs that exist, that are created within the existing floor space of a primary dwelling unit, must be permitted without consideration of public health, safety, and traffic flow.
Thank you. Commissioner Behringer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just out of curiosity, how do you guys do the calculus on traffic flow? Is it a last guy in analysis? I mean, because obviously there's some number where it becomes untenable. I mean, because these streets were not designed for double the development that is currently in place. So how do you guys reach a level where you say, no, we can't, from a traffic standpoint, accommodate any more units? Have you looked into that calculus, or?
We've not done such an analysis for this. It's not a quantitative traffic study type of analysis.
Yeah.
We're looking at other qualitative factors, like if the streets are crowded and visibility is reduced, people backing out might enter oncoming traffic,
Right.
cause people to come to a screeching halt, cause backups. People not able to find parking on the street are circling, looking for places, or double parking to run in to their friend's house or
Right.
their house to grab something. It's not a quantitative, last in, type of
Okay, well, I'm just
situation.
wondering if we're going to defend this, if there has to be some type of an analysis, it's a little more quantitative than empirical, which is, by the way, I agree with what you're saying. That's a practical approach to it, but maybe might be a requirement for something a little more quantitative that's done by a traffic engineer, perhaps. The other question is, there's got to be some type of a nexus that can be drawn between absolute capacity of our infrastructure, because, again, the infrastructure was not designed for our community to be doubled with no input. So how does that work? Is that being done too? Because at some point, these things may exceed the capacity of our current infrastructure, and then what do we do? Are we required to continue to allow them, or can we say no more until we either increase the capacity or analyze where we are? Do we have that flexibility? That's probably a question for both of you.
Sure. Well, I'll speak to what the state laws allow. And the same provision which allows local agencies to consider public health and safety and traffic flow also allow specifically carve out public agencies' ability to designate areas where ADUs are allowed based on water and sewer.
So, for example, like Carmel, where they have a limited amount of water supply, they can prohibit ADUs because they don't even have enough to build real houses, much less auxiliary.
Yes, but I actually wrote Carmel's ADU ordinance and they didn't.
They did not? They did not? Oh, I'm shocked. I'm totally shocked.
Commissioner Gordon.
Thank you, Chair. So my concern really is in the narrow streets, and we're talking about trying to fashion some kind of objective criteria. What pops into my mind, and I know well the street that Commissioner Campbell's referring to, where you're just simply not allowed to park on the street because it's too narrow. You can't get somebody did die when an emergency vehicle couldn't pass through the street because of the cars parked on the street. It was really bad. It happened a couple of years ago in our neighborhood. So my concern really is the narrow streets. And why couldn't we simply use some criteria where you assume the worst case scenario, where you've got a car parked, an average sized car parked on those sides of the street that allow it. So for example, if parking is allowed on both sides of the street, then you assume that cars are parked on both sides of the street, and then there has to be clearance for a fire truck to get through or an emergency vehicle to get through. And so then some streets, actually the street where the fatality happened, parking was only allowed on one side of the street, but the car was parked there, and it was a big SUV, or big truck like a Dodge Ram, and the fire truck still couldn't get through. So that's why anyway, the analysis would have to sort of depend on the street and the parking that was allowed. But why couldn't you simply do a worst case scenario, car parked on the sides where they could park, and is there clearance for an emergency vehicle to get through? And why wouldn't that, so you'd need a minimum street width requirement, and that would be justified by health and safety concerns. Kristen's like, I thought we were done with this.
Yet another position you've taken, Commissioner Gordon. No, to be fair, I think that it's possible to do that analysis. Again, we haven't performed it yet. I think I would have some reservations about performing it because I'm confident the outcome would be large chunks of the city where ADUs may not be permitted, and I don't know how that looks compared to the legislative intent to allow them in as many places as possible. We certainly can't prohibit them, and I'm fairly certain we can't have the effect of prohibiting them. So, when we hit that line, I think I would want to consult with the city attorney's office and see how Ms. Doherty feels about that. But
Well,
we could perform that type of
All right. I mean, there's plenty of streets that are plenty wide, too. I mean, Lindemar Boulevard is plenty wide,
Agreed, but to use that specific example with the revised transit map, most sections of Lindemar and Park Pacifica will have to provide off-street parking for their ADU unless it meets one of the other exemptions. And so on that basis, it's exceedingly difficult to provide additional off-street parking on a 5,000 square foot Lindemar Rancher site. So then you have another layer and another layer and another layer, and effectively you're prohibiting ADUs when you're not saying you're prohibiting ADUs. And so I think I have that concern as we add on additional factors.
Right. Well, it would be terrible to be enacting an ordinance where you're creating, a risk, a public health. I'm not even being facetious here. We saw it happen in our neighborhood. It'd be terrible to create a law that would allow the kind of cramping of a street that would prevent, emergency vehicles from passing through. It's very concerning.
Sure, and I just like
So I realize that, you're concerned about the cumulative effects, which is fair, but, if we're grounding what we're potentially doing in objective data, objective criteria, and real-world experience, I guess I'm less concerned.
I completely understand where you're coming from, Commissioner. I would also offer for your consideration that I have a concern that the more stringent you try to be on the front end, the more likely you are to incentivize bad actors to take advantage of what I think are two key loopholes in the state law and, by result, an extension in our ordinance. One is that if you can perform an addition to your home, say it's for some purpose other than an ADU, come in anytime after it's been finalized by the city and say now it's an ADU, and since it's created within the existing area of a structure, you don't have to provide any parking, and thank you, have a nice day. A similar problem results from accessory structures, which could be created in all kinds of other configurations that are unpalatable to a single-family neighborhood, including, as close as 18 inches to the property lines in some cases, and construct that, say it's my shed or what have you, and then convert it later. So I don't think there's a lot of good ways for us to get around this problem entirely. So I think having a balanced approach is good. I think trying to ratchet up too far, we're going to have some unintended consequences further down the road.
Commissioner Campbell.
Yeah, I could see that happening, and I know there's bad actors who do that in town, and all of us see that. But I wouldn't want to prevent this data collection on this important safety issue based on the potential actions of bad actors, because then they win, and they're going to do that anyway. You're right. They're going to do it. They're not going to pay the fees for ADU or not. So I mean, I think we should focus, our efforts on the hopefully the vast majority of the law-abiding folks out in town who will try to do the right thing and just make it real and give them clear direction. I mean, I would really like to see how much of the town is affected by this, and then I'd be interested in playing out the string a little bit, in that if it does, let's say, burden 50% of the town, or prevent 50% of what would have been an ADU area from being an ADU area, and we get sued by somebody, we have pretty good, I don't know, do we have decent facts to support, to defend? I mean, I don't want to get too down the line, but that's why God invented lawyers, right? I mean, we get sued, but we're going to have some data to maybe defend ourselves if we do this. And it is no joke, and we're not trying to get around ADUs this way. It's no joke, a real public health and safety issue.
So I guess my perspective is that I myself am of the view that this maybe is a difference to some of my fellow commissioners. I actually think that this is a good state law. I think this is a public policy that's important, and frankly, I think it's something that ought to be encouraged. I am, concerned about safety concerns, and if there's real data, and it sounds like, at least anecdotally, I'm hearing there are some significant concerns with respect to safety, I think we ought to have real, concrete, discrete data around what the safety issues are, and that we ought to develop some exceptions to the general rules that are narrow to address the specific safety concerns that may exist. I think we've got a clear state policy here. I myself am a little nervous about just throwing the city in front of litigation or frankly, sort of cutting against what is a pretty clear legislative intent expressed here. That said, again, if there are things that can be done, or if there are data that exist out there that suggests that we have a public safety or a significant traffic flow issue, then I think we need to address those things and maybe develop appropriate standards to deal with that. But I'd hate to see large swaths of the city rendered exempt from general rules favoring ADUs.
And if I may, Chair, ask a question of Commissioners Gordon and Campbell. In the areas that you're thinking of with the narrow streets and the safety concerns, would you estimate that most of the homes do or do not have two-car garages currently?
I would say most of the homes have one-car garages.
And so perhaps another way to go about this, resulting in a similar effect, is to embrace one of the other recommendations that would maybe be based on a different set of analyses and factors about requiring the two-car garage to be eligible for an ADU, as opposed to basing it off of the narrowness of the streets or other health and safety factors from that standpoint. I think in the areas that you're thinking of, if they're the areas that I'm thinking of, they're likely to be affected by both of these almost equally, because most of the homes in these neighborhoods with narrow streets don't have two-car garages in most instances that I can think of. And so there just may be another alternative that yields almost an identical outcome that may be somewhat easier to justify from a finding standpoint. It would be a heavy lift to go citywide and figure out the widths of every street. I'm not sure the planning department has such a resource or a list, and I'm not sure how readily, our sister departments could produce such an analysis.
So tell me so you're proposing being based on,
We have a slide for that coming up. We can get to it now, Mr. Chair, or we can
Yeah,
wait.
go ahead.
So this happens to be the slide. It was the next one. So we identified the 3 areas in the state law and in our ordinance where staff believes we still have some room to exercise local discretion in crafting the ordinance. One of them is in terms of the condition of the existing primary dwelling unit at the site where the ADU is being contemplated. And so when we drafted the first version of this ordinance, we embraced what we understood the intent of the state law to be, which was to allow ADUs in as many places as possible, with some limited sort of bottom line requirements for what they need to do. They need to comply with the ADU standards, but we're going to essentially turn a blind eye to the condition of the primary dwelling unit because we know so much of our community was constructed before incorporation, before rigorous zoning standards and so forth. As I indicated earlier in the conversation, we know that we could have the effect of ruling out accessory dwelling units in large portions of the city if we took too strict of a line on the condition of the existing primary dwelling unit. But with that said, the Commission's feedback about parking in particular led us to go back and analyze the state law and the ordinance. And to be fair, we do have some discretion related to traffic flow and public safety, as we mentioned earlier. So one potential option for the Commission is to change the components of the existing proposed ordinance that would be permissive for the non-conforming primary dwelling unit that's existing. When it doesn't have a 2-car garage, it would not be eligible for construction of an accessory dwelling unit, more specifically an attached or detached ADU, perhaps not one that's created within the existing floor area of the primary dwelling unit. So the question to the Commission is, should we require the primary unit to meet the off-street parking requirement? And since ADUs are only to be constructed on sites with existing single-family homes, that would mean the single-family home has to have a 2-car side-by-side garage, minimum 18 feet wide by 19 feet deep. It's a bit like a unicorn in some parts of the city, but they're out there, and homes built today would have to comply with this. But so much of our housing stock having not been built within the last 20, 30, 50, 60, in some cases 80 years or more, many of them don't comply with this. When considering this, we would need to know, are certain reduced dimensions acceptable? Would you be okay with 16 feet wide by 18 feet deep? I would say in my experience reviewing plan checks, and perhaps my colleagues can weigh in, it's not uncommon to have a 16-foot wide garage, 17 feet deep, maybe 18 feet deep. Very few, but very few comply with 18 feet wide by 19 feet deep. So I think I've belabored the point that it would have a big impact, but it could be a meaningful impact if you're trying to make sure that the existing development pattern is not unduly burdening the street for parking before you authorize development that would perhaps generate additional vehicles. We would also ask, would tandem parking be acceptable in these cases? If it's a 1-car, Valley Mar type garage, but perhaps it's clear through to the backyard, could they add on in a tandem configuration to provide that second car? And would you accept that to then allow them to construct an ADU? So there's some wiggle room here, but really the question is, are you requiring them to have 2 off-street garage spaces before you would entertain an application for an ADU? So it is a policy option that the Commission has. We'd also need to know, would you be willing to grant a parking exception or a minor modification to waive one of the spaces? Our recommendation is not to allow that. We think it's relatively easy in the scheme of permits to make the findings to grant these kinds of exceptions, and to do so would frustrate the Commission's intent if it went this route. But we would hope to get answers to these questions. But then you also have the possibility of the loopholes that we talked about. Certainly, we shouldn't draft all of our laws to address bad actors. We should assume people will abide by the law, and we have mechanisms to try to ensure that. But there are some pretty apparent loopholes within the state law and the framework that it provides.
Christian, just a quick question. I know we're talking about different overlays. So like the this analysis doesn't apply to areas that have serviceable transit, the transit areas, right? Because everything's waived there.
Yeah, just allow me 1 second to confirm.
So your interpretation is that if it's going to be within the existing floor area ADUs, regardless of all of these traffic flow and safety, we have to allow the ADU.
This is like really jackhammering a square peg in a round hole. I like the parking.
See how this can apply off in areas that are like close to
Your city would apply to. What's that? This would apply to the entire city.
Yeah.
So do you have a picture of the new transit? Right.
If we're going to apply these findings to within existing,
Have a packet either.
we have to allow them.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really useful.
Page 355.
That's the next question.
Yes.
So to me, that's a different type of ADU
Yeah.
with a different type of parking.
I'm not quite sure which is which.
So didn't he say that it like changed things dramatically?
Yeah. Well, I guess this is dramatically.
Here it is. Here's the one from April. That's the April one. And then here's the new one.
So it could prohibit an ADU that's otherwise within the.
Do that again? What?
Right, there's the one from that.
Okay.
So your neck of the woods is like completely.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
Oops. Shit.
For subdivision, and then for within existing space, none of this.
Could you say that again?
For ADUs within the existing space, this doesn't apply at all.
Right, okay. Yeah, so if we're talking about an attached ADU, which is constructed by adding onto an existing structure, or a detached ADU, these findings would allow the city to prohibit an ADU even if it was located within a half mile of transit. The other scenario is an ADU created within the existing floor area of a primary dwelling unit or accessory structure. Those would still need to be allowed regardless of this particular finding.
I see that Commissioner Clifford's been patiently waiting. I'm going to go ahead and call on him.
I actually put that light on when we were talking about health and safety. And looking at this other option, I'm actually thinking that we would have a more defensible position if we were talking about health and safety versus the single-car garage. Because there are a lot of streets with single-car garages that are wide enough to accommodate additional parking on the street. But there are streets, as Commissioner Campbell and Commissioner Gordon have mentioned, that simply would not be safe with additional parking on the street. And so just looking at the two options, if we were concerned about over-regulating to the point that we don't have enough to actually look like we're complying with the state law, I would be more comfortable going with health and safety than I would be a single-car garage.
Well, would we not be relying on health and safety to the extent that we were going to go this route anyway? We're talking about essentially traffic flow, and that's the whole rationale for requiring the garages in the first place.
And the rationale is to ensure that the ADU is in keeping with the city's conforming parking standards for the primary dwelling units as opposed to the ADU.
But how does that sort of run up then against state law then that's essentially is attempting to put aside sort of local community, concerns or standards, at least to some extent? I don't know if it's stated quite that way.
No, I think it's a good question. The state laws would allow a local agency to apply its building code standards. And so in so much as the primary dwelling unit parking standards are similar to some of the construction standards required under the building code, we would consider this provision to be ensuring that those properties on which an ADU is proposed to be located be brought up to code in order for the ADU to be constructed.
I see. Well, I've always sort of conceived of the building code being different from parking standards, though.
Right, but it's the same, my thought is it's the same idea, right? That in order to construct an ADU, one must bring the primary dwelling unit up to code, including conforming parking standards.
Is that, and the state law, as
State law doesn't expressly prohibit that, although it doesn't expressly allow for that either.
I see. So there's,
So it's a lenient interpretation of the state laws.
okay, thank you. Commissioner Campbell.
That was interesting. Yeah, no, I mean, I think, okay, so for attached ADUs, this method of trying to get at the parking situation, if it's within a half mile of the transit, this doesn't apply, right? If you're doing an attached ADU, this parking requirement wouldn't apply?
It would. So let me just...
For an attached, okay.
Yeah, let me just step back and clarify. So there's three categories contemplated in state law, three categories of ADUs. There's the detached ADU, which everybody understands. There's the attached ADU, which everyone understands until you introduce the third category, which is created within the existing floor area. So even though they sound similar, they're different. The attached ADU, as it's contemplated in the state law in our ordinance, requires construction of additional floor area, whether it's on the ground or above, what have you. Existing floor area means you don't get a building permit to add on anything. You're converting and carving down your 1,200 square foot house to 900 square feet to make a 300 square foot ADU. So there's the three categories. This would not apply to the third category, created within the existing living area.
Okay, attached within the existing floor area ratio.
Right.
So if we went the public health and safety route of streets, street widths, same analysis applies to all three categories?
That's my understanding from consultation with Ms. Doherty, yes. The state law would not allow us to impose these additional findings or standards if the ADU is created within the existing living area of the primary dwelling unit.
Okay.
So I'm wondering, just in deference to the hour, whether or not we might be in a position to maybe give some guidance to staff with respect to, I guess, let's start with this off-street parking for primary dwelling units, this particular provision that's discussed under subsection F on page 261, 262 of the packet. This is small Roman numeral 1, I guess. Whether or not, because this is obviously going to have to come back to us if, in fact, we're going to, I think, if this is, or is this already contemplated in what you've got drafted right now, if we're going to do something like this?
I think we feel generally comfortable with the scenarios we've outlined here. If the commission wanted a different line of analysis based on street widths and the direct health and safety concerns related to that, we've not performed that analysis. We would need to come back.
So the ordinance that we have in our packet right now that we could be acting on, does it contemplate this off-street parking? Does it contemplate this scenario that you got laid out here?
Yes, we've not drafted the language, but I think with clear direction from the commission, we could make those changes to the ordinance that we take to the city council without returning to the planning commission.
Got it. Okay, so that's, I guess the question is whether or not we, how we feel about this, and maybe just take them one at a time might be the best way, how we feel about this in particular. Does anybody care to offer perspective on it?
Just want to go down the line?
Sure. Why don't we start with you, Commissioner Clifford? What do you think?
It's convenient for me.
Off-street parking.
I'm not sure that's the best process. You're gonna get because we need 1, 2, 3, 4. We need 4 votes for each prong in order to give him direction.
I want to know if there, I guess, and what I'm trying to figure out is whether or not there is support for this. I mean, we could just take a vote on an overall motion, but I think it might be efficient just so that staff has got a clear perspective on how we feel about each of these points.
We don't need a motion on these 4 items. We will just need a motion on the ordinance with or without these 4 items.
Okay, so Another fair answer is, well, I just need to think about it some more.
Yeah, I really do need to think about it some more.
I want my cake and eat it, and want to eat it too. I mean, I want to go through this, but I also want for staff at least to kind of explore this health and safety traffic road width issue.
Okay.
So that there's a plan B.
Understood.
Like if you come back and say, you know what, that's going to be a $1 million study that we can't do, then, that's germane, and maybe we go to plan B. But I just don't know enough to, right now, maybe nobody does, to say that's an untenable. But I like the idea of looking at road widths and public health and safety a little bit more than this one, because there are streets, I'm thinking Pedro Point now, where there's a lot of two-car garage homes, big garages, terrible street parking, big safety issues. Same thing with Rockaway. Valamar, a little different, a lot more one-car garage. So I would hate, but so I think there's some streets where you're going to have the one-car garage where you could put ADUs, and they're going to be unfairly singled out, and there's going to be streets, with the two cars that are, you're going to add more ADUs, and it's going to make it worse. So
I see your point.
That's why I still like the road width. I don't know if there's a way to do it, but.
Okay, thank you.
I would still like to go through this. I mean, I'm still open to that.
Commissioner Gordon?
In terms of the street width approach, I'm just wondering, obviously I don't want Christian to go out and with a tape measure for 2 straight weeks to every street in Pacifica. That would be terrible. I'm wondering if there's a way to approach that by taking a sampling of streets, and then put the burden on the applicant to have to show that, rather than you go out and say, well, this street's okay, this street's not okay, put the burden on come up with some dimensions, and then say, applicant, you have the burden of showing that your street complies with these standards. Anyway, that might save you the horrendous onerous burden of doing that. And having said that, so I'm in favor of exploring that, the street width. I think that gets to the issues so much more directly. If the street's wide enough, I don't really have the concerns. Anyway, and in terms of that, I'm definitely in favor of it. I think it's very creative, and I'm in favor of a strict approach. Although you were saying that in terms of a garage width, that 17 by 18 is a lot more common than 18 by 19. So I'd be okay with carving that out a little bit. Otherwise, I'm into a strict interpretation of that.
Commissioner Behringer, aside from your general opposition to the...
Aside from this is one giant non sequitur, I think that anything we can do to make this more restrictive so that we have the opportunity to have a thoughtful discussion on development like we do on everything else we do here, I'm for it.
Okay.
And that was my primary opposition to this, is it takes away the opportunity for us as a community to have a thoughtful discussion on things like where the road is too narrow and there is a real life safety issue there. We should have the opportunity to have that conversation. Whatever conclusions come from that, it depends on how that conversation goes. But to have that conversation preempted and turn this into a by right situation, which, is going to create a problem downstream, I'm opposed to. So, I'd like to see more restrictions, and I'd like to have the minimum requirements that we would require people to do if they were constructing on a raw land, lot. I don't see any reason why we would depart from that. I think they should follow the same rules. So
Okay, well, if there's data that supports, to your point, sort of public safety, particularly these narrow streets that you all have been talking about, I'm certainly open to that. I'd vote against this. I don't agree with this at all. I think it is unduly restrictive. So that's how I feel about that.
And I never put my 2 cents in, but on this one, if we had to go this route, I would generally support it. I would be against tandem parking, just because, having lived in a neighborhood with tandem parking once, it doesn't work. It's a horrible quality of life issue. Basically, you have cars driving right up beneath your bedroom window on the side yards. It's terrible. So I oppose it.
Okay. Christian, did you have a slide relating to distance between structures? Is that something else we need to talk about?
Yes. The next area where we identified the ability to exercise some local discretion was relative to the development standards for ADUs, and specifically the distance between structures we thought would provide an opportunity to arrive at a more orderly layout for sites where an ADU is proposed. Of course, this would apply primarily, if not exclusively, to detached ADUs. Attached ADUs would comply with the main building setbacks, the 5 feet on the sides already, and would yield this 10-foot separation between its site and the dwelling units on the neighboring sites, but would have essentially a 0-foot separation between the primary dwelling unit and the ADU, just by the very nature of it being an attached ADU. So for detached ADUs, keeping that in mind, we felt that a 10-foot separation would be analogous to the separation that occurs between primary dwelling units in single-family neighborhoods. The minimum separation you would expect is 10 feet, 5 feet to your side property line, and another 5 feet from the property line to your neighbor's dwelling unit. So currently, the ordinance proposes 5 feet. 10 feet seems reasonable and defensible in my mind. Similar to the previous discussion, would the commission entertain a variance or a minor modification to reduce this standard if there's some unique topographical or other site-specific constraint that would prevent satisfying the 10-foot requirement and would otherwise deny someone the ability to pursue an ADU? There's the sort of the more fundamental, rights considerations that need to be made with any development, and providing relief, and this is a case where staff would support including an opportunity for a variance. That would be a discretionary permit, and it would come before the Planning Commission. The way the ordinance is drafted, the commission would consider all of the normal factors for a variance, but would not be allowed to consider the use of the site as an ADU. It would be evaluating the physical constraints.
Okay, excellent. Commissioner Campbell, did you have a question or a comment?
No.
Commissioner Clifford, sorry.
My comment is I agree with staff's recommendations here. I like the 10-foot minimum separation, and I recognize that there would be times when a variance would be meet the conditions that are presented.
Okay, Commissioner Campbell, this time I'm sure it's you.
I agree. I agree with Commissioner Clifford's comments.
Me too.
Commissioner Behringer, anything to note?
No, I agree with that, actually. Much to your surprise, I'm sure.
I don't agree with the change. Okay, next one.
Okay.
Mr. Chair, did you say you do? Or
I do not.
Okay. And the third area was the maximum accessory dwelling unit floor area. There was some concern on the part of the commission at the last public hearing that for detached ADUs, the 1,200 square foot maximum contemplated in state law was inappropriate. It would result in detached ADUs that were too large and that would dwarf certain existing primary dwelling units. There's not a clear opportunity to impose a lower restriction in state law, but there is some basis for that in the memo that was attached. I believe it's attachment I, the California Department of Housing and Community Development memo. They make sort of passing reference to having some other reduced maximum size, I think as small as 850 square feet. So there's some basis to do it. The state agency that typically interprets and provides guidance on state housing law has mentioned that in its guidance memo on ADU legislation. So the commission could choose to rely on that. It's staff's recommendation not to. Should the commission proceed with a reduction below 1,200 square feet, we'd recommend not going below the 850 square feet called out in the memo. We'd also ask, would you consider some other combination standard, so a ratio, for instance, not to exceed 50% of the primary dwelling unit, but not less than 850 square feet, or something to that effect. So you could have a larger ADU if you have a large home, so you don't have that proportionate
consideration, but ultimately, it's up to the commission what they feel comfortable with.
Yeah, Christian, can we have also a third standard, which would be lot coverage in total?
We do. I mean, we could. We currently have indicated you need to comply with the underlying zoning district's lot coverage. So for the R1 zone, for instance, where most of these would be considered, it's 40%.
Right.
I can't wrap my head around imposing a greater or a more restrictive lot coverage simply because an ADU is proposed.
No, I'm just saying, though,
Yeah.
that let's say if you, whatever percentage we come up with, let's just say 850 together with the existing structure is more than a 40% coverage, that would be a disqualifier.
Yes, and it would already, under the ordinance as it's drafted, you would have to already comply with the lot coverage restriction.
Okay, well, I thought they had some exemptions on that. They don't? I thought the ADU could exceed the lot coverage ratios in our community.
Not in my recollection.
Great. Any guidance for staff with respect to this matter? I had a question, actually. I mean, I think you'd indicated that this was not staff's recommendation to go this direction. Is it because of the fact that the guidance from the fact that it's a little bit ambiguous, the extent to which we have the authority to take this action?
I think so, and I think that the significant departure from what we believe is the clear limit set forth in state law, 1,200 square feet to 850 square feet, it's a sizable reduction, and we think that that could be the type of thing that people could take exception to, and that could be a greater area of risk for our ordinance.
Thank you. Comments? Commissioner Clifford.
Well, actually, I like the idea of bringing it down to 850, which is the maximum we have now, if I'm not mistaken. We have, if an ADU meets handicap accessible standards, then it can go to 850. Going to 1,200 on your standard 5,000 square foot lot is going to really be pushing the lot coverage.
Well, I think...
I'm really concerned about winding up with a whole nother development inside our existing developments.
Well, I think the chance that would happen is very low. So if you take a 5,000 square foot lot, you take out the setbacks from the front, 15 feet, sides 5 feet, rear 20 feet, even with a small 1,000 square foot existing primary dwelling unit, right? So you don't want it to dwarf the small, I don't know, Sharp Park or Valley Mar home. 1,000 square feet, a 5,000 square foot lot with 40% lot coverage would be a 2,000 square foot maximum coverage. You add in the setbacks, you add in the minimum 10 feet separation, you know, the maximum you could have would be 1,000 square feet before you add in all of those restrictions. So I think the chance that you're going to see the 1,200 square foot mega ADU on a 5,000 square foot lot is very low. Could there be some strange configuration where it's possible? Maybe. I haven't thought through every scenario. I don't think that that's the likely outcome of this standard. I think the 10,000 square foot lot that's going to construct an ADU, you may see the 1,200 square foot detached accessory structure.
Thank you for that.
Commissioner Campbell.
I don't know. I still see the concern, quite frankly. I mean, that's still a lot for a 5,000 square foot. Now, what about substandard lots?
So again, at the outset, we drafted this ordinance to be as permissive as we could in implementing what we took to be the legislature's intent. We, again, drafted this largely to turn a blind eye to nonconformities that exist with the existing site and the existing structures. So provided that you could construct the ADU to comply with all of the standards for the ADU, then we would issue a building permit. We didn't provide any special dispensation for sites that had nonconformities or had reduced lot sizes or anything like that. You have to meet the standards. If you don't, you can't build it.
Right. Thank you. I would still go with the 850, though, even with that. There's just too many small substandard lots, and I still think it's a lot, so I think 850 is sufficient.
So you're in support of this
this, I wouldn't call it a proposal, but this sort of matter is described in the maximum floor area
Yeah,
portion of the report.
yes.
Okay. Does anybody else have anything to share on that?
I'd agree with my commissioners who've spoken so far.
Well, I'm opposed to it. I believe it's probably, I think it's too much of a stretch, given the law as I understand it, and well, I don't agree with it in principle in any event.
If you have a 40% coverage, I think 850 in some areas is about all you're going to be able to do anyway, because you're going to exceed the 40%. I mean, I was just doing the math. If you have a 5,000 square foot lot and you've got a 1,200 square foot house on there, 850 is going to put you at 41% coverage. So I think 850 is probably going to, in the majority of our community, is probably going to be all you're going to be able to do anyway. So I like the lot coverage approach. To me, it allows for some flexibility, and you can deal with the reality of how big the lot is.
Sure, and we took steps to address the scaling question and the proportionate relationship question with our last revision. We instituted a height restriction that said the ADU cannot exceed the height of the primary dwelling unit, or 25 feet, whichever is less. If it's attached, then it can go up to the 35-foot height limit, but I think, in my opinion, the combined approach of lot coverage, the height restriction, the setbacks, the distance between structures, you're not likely to get 1,200 square foot ADUs on 5,000 square foot lots. And I think you're potentially exposing the city to risk by taking such an aggressive departure, but that, I'm sure, has been noted by the commission, and you'll make your recommendation as you see fit.
All right, I'm changing my mind.
Commissioner Campbell.
Oops, sorry.
Commissioner Campbell, go ahead.
Well, you made a persuasive case on that, and City Council, would you agree with that? And so, actually, after hearing that exchange, I'm going to change my mind.
Commissioner Gordon.
Me too.
Got it. So we've had a chance to walk through. I think, is there another slide? I think this is everything.
That's it.
Okay. And so we've spent a little time working our way through this. I want to come back to sort of my understanding of kind of where we are at this point. The ordinance that we would be voting on, that's in the packet attached to the materials here, incorporates these 3 points we were just discussing, or I guess the limit in particular on maximum floor area. I'm a little concerned about that because it sounds like the consensus of the commission is they likely would not support that if a motion was made. Is that baked into the ordinance?
I'm not sure I understood
Well, let me
the
see
commission's
if I can
position on the floor area as the same as you portrayed it. I believe we have at least 3 votes in favor of keeping it at 1,200 square feet. Commissioners Campbell and Gordon changed their position.
Oh, okay, well, that's what I meant, is they're not in favor anymore of deviating from the 1,200 square feet.
Sure, so that would result in no change to the ordinance as it's drafted.
Okay.
So just to clarify, items A through E were written or not written into the report as Christian explained per staff's recommendation. And items, the 3 items under section F were not written into the ordinance pending direction.
So the proposal, though, based on the direction you've gotten, is you would be able to incorporate changes reflecting the commission's position into the ordinance that ultimately goes to the city council.
Right. Right, that was our intention coming into this meeting, but I think that the discussion with the street, the health and safety street width issue is something that we need to come back. So I think that is, if I'm understanding the commission correctly, the last outstanding policy consideration that we need to do further research on.
Is that the general intent or desire of the commission, that we get some more information on that, even in light of the 2-car garage piece that might or might not, frankly, obviate a big piece of that? Okay.
Gee, when you put it that way.
Well,
No, I'm kidding. Yes, because I do think it's an important public health and safety issue we should explore.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Well, I think that's the guidance of the commission.
Thinking about a continuation or not, or,
I'd like to. Yeah.
okay.
You guys in agreement on everything other than that?
Yeah. Well, there may be a majority that is. I'm not going to vote for this.
There may be enough votes to pass.
We need more people to offset me yet once again.
August 21st. So the second meeting in August, August 21st, I think would give us enough time.
All right, well, that'd be great. I'll be looking forward to it. Fantastic.
Get a motion to continue.
So it looks like Commissioner Clifford has pushed his button.
I move that we continue this item till August 21st. Is that what I heard?
Yes.
Commissioner Campbell?
I'll second that.
Okay, so we've got a motion and a second. Why don't we go ahead and vote? So it's been unanimously voted in favor, continuing this item to August 21st. Thank you. All right. So we've got one more item here, and this is text amendment TA 10817, initiated by the City of Pacifica to consider amendments to Title IX, Chapter 4, Article 28 of the Pacifica Municipal Code to require the installation of electric vehicle charging stations. The text amendment would affect property citywide. The Planning Commission will consider the text amendment and make a recommendation to the City Council. Recommended CEQA action is General Rule Exemption, CEQA Guideline Section 150161B3 in Class 1, 3, and 4 categorical exemptions, CEQA Guidelines 15301, 15303, and 15304 sub F. The recommended action is to adopt the resolution recommending amendments. Can we get a staff report?
Yes, thank you, and good evening, Commissioners. I am Assistant Planner Bonnie O'Connor. Tonight I am presenting for your recommendation an ordinance for electric vehicle charging stations. In 2014, the City Council adopted a climate action plan that included the goal of developing policies to encourage the installation of public electric vehicle charging stations at hotels, municipal parking lots, and shopping center parking lots. The proposed ordinance would directly respond to this climate action plan goal and would contribute to item 4 of the City Council's work plan, which is implementation of the climate action plan. This ordinance would expand current residential electric vehicle requirements detailed in the adopted 2016 Cal Green section of the California Building Code, which requires new residential dwellings to include electric vehicle spaces. The ordinance would require that new construction of or major alteration of commercial or municipal facilities install electric vehicle charging stations. Parking lots with 9 or less parking spaces would need to establish an electric vehicle space with electric vehicle supply equipment in place for future installation of a charger. Parking lots larger than 10 spaces would need to install an electric vehicle charging station. The ordinance would also detail design standards of electric vehicle charging stations for public and private use to ensure public charging stations are well posted with instructions and warnings, and private charging stations do not create a visual nuisance to the neighborhood. Lastly, the ordinance would require that electric vehicle charging stations can be used by everyone by requiring the first electric vehicle charging stations on each site to meet the van accessible dimension requirements. Staff recommends that Planning Commission adopt the attached resolution to recommend the proposed ordinance to City Council for adoption. Please let me know if you have any questions.
Thanks so much. Are there any questions for staff as to this item? Looks like Commissioner Clifford.
In reading this, I was wondering, was there any consideration to having charging stations at our current gas stations and how they might be laid out? Because at some point, the hope is that we're going to be all electric and/or hydrogen, whatever, but the actual commercial stations would be set up. And I'm seeing apartment buildings, I'm seeing parking garages, things like that, but I'm not seeing actual commercial gas stations being included in this.
So I'm not quite sure how to answer that, because that's a business that's in the business of selling gas, not charging vehicles. Yeah, and so I guess my answer to that is as the type of vehicles change more and more, I think that if we see those types of businesses diversifying, that there's nothing in the ordinance that would preclude or prohibit them from installing such stations if they so choose.
I would also add that as the ordinance is written now, if a new gas station was to be established or went under major alteration, that based on the number of parking spaces that they would be required to establish for employees or whatever our code requires, that they would be required to install the EV, likely EV-ready spaces on site, which could be used by either visitors or the employees.
Thank you.
Commissioner Behringer.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair. Are those stations, are you going to require some to be free and some to be for fee? How does that work?
The ordinance doesn't get into the usage fees. That would be up to the property owner of how they want to handle that.
Okay, because my thinking was if it's a fee-based thing and you're requiring it in certain commercial endeavors, then I can understand it because it's a business type thing. And I was also wondering if you were going to require it in the residential developments, like apartment buildings, condominiums, things like that.
So the Cal Green Building Code, the 2016 Cal Green Building Code that was adopted, addresses those, that use.
And how about retrofitting of existing buildings? That's not a requirement at this point. Would there be a trigger if there was going to be a substantial rehab or something that might trigger it?
Correct.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Behringer. Any other questions or comments? Well, I'd entertain a motion that if there was one.
Is there public comment?
Oh, geez, thank you. I'm sort of starting to lose it here, obviously. I don't know if there's anybody who wanted to address the public on this matter, but I'll go ahead and open the public hearing. I don't have any cards, and I don't see anybody jumping up at the moment to make any comments. So I will go ahead then and thank you for the reminder, close public hearing and bring it back to the commission. Commissioner Gordon.
Thank you, Chair. I'm really excited about this potential text amendment, and glad to see Pacifica is moving in that step, and I appreciate the work of the Climate Action Committee. Committee? Isn't there a committee? No.
There was a task force that was created to
Task
create the
force.
plan, but that's no longer together.
Anyway, very appreciative of that, and I see charging stations all over the place, but I haven't seen them in Pacifica. I've driven an electric car for the past 4 years, and they come in handy, seriously. So I'm enthusiastically in favor and ready to make a motion, but I see there's no light.
All right. Oh, that was, why don't you go ahead and make your motion? Sorry. Just, it's in there somewhere.
For those in the audience, our packet was over 400 pages today, so we haven't all printed it out.
Could you work from that?
Sure. So the motion's on page 472?
You can find it on 468.
Oh, sorry.
468. Great. Okay. I'm going to move that the Planning Commission adopt the resolution included in Attachment B recommending that the City Council amend Title IX, Chapter 4, Article 28 of the Pacific Municipal Code to establish regulations for electric vehicle charging spaces and electric vehicle charging stations, that the zoning amendments are exempt from the California Environmental Quality Act and incorporate all maps and testimony in the record by reference.
Thank you, Commissioner Gordon. Commissioner Campbell.
I'll second that.
Excellent. So we've got a motion and we've got a second, so why don't we go ahead and vote? Okay, excellent. So that motion was approved on a 5-0 vote unanimously. And we will then go on to communications, commission communications. Any of my colleagues have commission communications to share. Commissioner Clifford.
I just wanted to report back from the city council meeting where I went as was commission's representative. They did, in fact, vote to place the marijuana initiative on the ballot. They did make a couple of changes in content, which I think Commissioner Campbell will be happy to hear that they asked the police chief to work up a social host ordinance to make people who actually purchase the marijuana responsible for its safekeeping.
Yep.
So that it didn't wind up in the hands of minors. And I also believe there was another change that staff dealt with.
Sure. So there was one change to the zoning ordinance, and that was to require that any site that's applying for a marijuana use permit put up a larger sign on the window like you see with ABC licenses. So it's a little bit more notice than typical. And then there was a change to the police public safety license having to do with larger corporations that may own these businesses, and when does it constitute a change in ownership, and when do they need to come back in and go through a new licensing process?
Excellent. Well, thank you for that report. And Commissioner Clifford, thank you for attending on behalf of the commission. We really appreciate that. Any staff communications?
Sure. Just real quickly, I wanted to mention that the Fassler EIR comment period closes on the 24th, next Monday. So once we go through the comments that we receive, you'll be hearing another update from us. And I also wanted to mention that the commission and staff received a letter from the Fairmont Homeowners Association stating that they felt that every property in the Fairmont subdivision should receive public notice of hearings. And so I just wanted to let you know, staff also received this, we reviewed it with council, and we are meeting the legal requirements for public noticing. That's it.
Thanks so much for the report, and thank you for all the work keeping us on track this evening. This is a very meaty agenda, and I really appreciate your work keeping us straight, or at least keeping me straight. Commissioner Gordon.
Are we ready to move to adjourn?
I think we are.
Move to adjourn.
Is there a second? I'll second. Doggone it. Okay. All in favor? Go ahead and vote. Okay, well, that's 5-0. We're adjourned.
Wow. Man.
It's too long.